Hey guys, tonight we're going to unravel something a little tragic, a little beautiful, and definitely a little deadly. Imagine falling in love, your heart pounding like a war drum every time you see them, and knowing that even one misstep could cost you everything. And by everything, I mean literally your life. Welcome to ancient China, where love wasn't just frowned upon outside of family approval. It could be a straight-up death sentence. Not the dramatic, metaphorical kind either. You could be exiled, executed, imprisoned, or if you were lucky, forced into a lifetime of quiet shame. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps keep these stories coming. Oh, and while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it over there? I love seeing how far this little bedtime caravan stretches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's set the scene. You're born in ancient China, let's say during the Han Dynasty, which gives us political drama, heavy Confucian vibes, and a social system tighter than a pair of fresh-bound feet. You're a teenager, hormones bubbling, and you lock eyes with someone across a courtyard. It's the moment every movie dreams of. But here, that connection is already a problem. You don't speak to strangers without supervision. You don't date. You don't court. You don't even get to choose who you marry. Your parents, and more accurately your father, have already drawn up a plan for you, probably involving alliances, dowries, or an attempt to improve family status. Your fate is decided by birth. Class determines everything. Who you can speak to, marry, flirt with, or even glance at too long. If you're a noble, your love life is basically a game of strategic chess. If you're a peasant, it's still controlled, but maybe with slightly more wiggle room, unless, of course, your crush is from a higher social class. That's when it gets dicey. The state itself had a vested interest in your heart, or more accurately, in keeping it chained. The emperor ruled with a mix of ritual, military force, and philosophy, especially Confucianism. This wasn't just some background cultural flavour, it was law, education, morality, everything, and Confucius was not big on passion. Harmony was the goal. The family came first, and your role within it was clearly defined. Love? That was unpredictable, selfish, chaotic, not to be trusted. Your body and desires weren't yours. The phrase filial piety came with very literal consequences. Say your parents arranged your marriage to a wealthy merchant's son or daughter. Now imagine rejecting that match because your heart was elsewhere. That wasn't just a romantic decision, it was an act of betrayal against your family. You weren't just breaking hearts, you were breaking the chain of ancestral loyalty. That could earn you public shame, disinheritance, or worse, punishment by the state, because personal love was seen as a dangerous rival to social stability. Now let's talk about eunuchs, because why not? They're everywhere in this story. Eunuchs, who were castrated and often served in the palace, were the ultimate safe servants in the eyes of the elite. Their inability to reproduce made them less of a threat, at least in theory, but they wielded immense influence behind the scenes. You couldn't trust anyone near the court, and romance among the palace staff, even rumours of it, could be fatal. Everyone was watching everyone else, and everyone was terrified of scandal. This paranoia helped keep the emperor on top and the population under tight emotional surveillance. Meanwhile, over in the women's quarters, things were just as grim. Upper-class women were expected to stay indoors, away from temptation and danger, and also fresh air, books, conversation, and freedom. You might spend most of your life behind lattice screens, only catching glimpses of the outside world. Maybe you write poetry to cope. Maybe you exchange glances with a household servant and feel your heart leap. That right there, that feeling could kill you. And here's where it gets especially twisted. The more elite your family was, the less likely you were to marry for love. That might sound backward, but for elites, marriage was diplomacy. For peasants, there was slightly more freedom, especially if no one was paying close attention. But the higher you climbed, the fewer choices you had. Love was for fools or rebels. If you dared fall for someone inappropriate, say, a musician, a servant, or, heaven forbid, someone from the enemy state, well, that's not just personal scandal, that's political treason. Here's a historical nugget. During the Tang Dynasty, which was known for its flourishing poetry and wild court dramas, An imperial concubine named Yang Guifei became infamous for her beauty and her love affair with Emperor Xuanzong. Their relationship may have started with affection, but it ended with a violent rebellion and her forced suicide. Was she truly in love? Was he? Historians debate that to this day. What's clear is that their connection disrupted the balance of power, and people died for it. But here's something quirkier. In some periods of Chinese history, there were lovers' knots, intricate knots tied into clothing, jewellery, or even hidden in letters. They symbolise secret affection. Imagine slipping someone a knot instead of a text. Romantic, right? Also deeply risky. If someone found that little knotted thread on you, you could be accused of improper conduct, even if nothing physical had happened. And then there's the great debate. Was love even considered necessary in marriage? Scholars still go back and forth. Some argue love grew after marriage. Others say it wasn't even a goal. Duty, family alignment, and financial arrangements were the true foundations. But even Confucius, stern as he was, once said that love in marriage made it stronger. He just never said how you were supposed to get there. So here you are, lying in your room, staring up at the wooden beams above your head, heartache lodged like a stone in your chest, knowing that the person you love is out there. But reaching for them could destroy both of your lives. Welcome to ancient China, where love wasn't just forbidden, it was feared. So let's zoom in on what happens after that first flutter of forbidden feeling. You're 16, maybe 17. Your family lives in a walled compound just outside the capital. Your father's a minor official, obsessed with rising in rank. Your mother keeps her mouth shut and eyes lowered. Your older brother is already married to a girl he met exactly once before the wedding day. The message is clear. Your destiny is decided by other people, and yet, somehow, you still catch feelings. Of course you do. It starts simple. A glance across the courtyard, maybe during a family banquet. The son of another official, tall, quiet, just enough mystery in his eyes to make your breath hitch. Or maybe you're the one on the other side. You see her walking past, her sleeves brushing the ground like petals, her eyes catching yours for a second too long, and in that single heartbeat, you're sunk. Too bad the system has already locked you in. Because ancient China didn't really do dating. Courtship, if you could even call it that, was an extremely controlled ritual. Families arranged marriages based on astrology, social class, and fortune-telling, sometimes when the kids were literal toddlers. If your birth charts aligned and your surnames didn't break taboos, congratulations, you were someone's future spouse. You might not even meet them until the wedding day. And matchmaking wasn't just a family matter, it was a state function. During the Tang and Song dynasties especially, matchmakers became official middlemen and women who worked under strict guidelines. They'd inspect the families, birth dates, dowries, and social standings. If someone got creative, say, lied about family wealth, or tried to match across classes, they could be punished. That's right, you could be arrested for bad matchmaking. Romantic rebellion was practically a crime scene. Let's say your family is deep into these customs. They've already hired a matchmaker to scope out potential alliances. You overhear the whispers. Some merchant's daughter, obedient, wide-hipped, politically useful. You want none of it. You want the person who writes poems on rice paper and leaves them under your window. The person who caught your hand that one time under the table, fingers brushing just long enough to light your entire nervous system on fire. But here's where it gets dangerous. If your family finds out about your secret love, the fallout could be immediate. For women, this meant beatings, confinement, even forced exile to a Buddhist convent. For men, it could be career suicide, especially if the object of your affection was considered beneath you. One disgraced son could ruin an entire lineage, so your father might go straight to the district magistrate. Now it's not just a family problem, it's a legal one. Here's a true historical tidbit to make it worse. During the Song dynasty, there were actual cases where young lovers were caught exchanging letters and punished with public humiliation, head shaving, or even forced servitude. Imagine getting sent to a labour camp for writing a love note. Romantic, right? And that's if you're lucky. Because under certain dynasties, like the Ming, women's virtue was so heavily policed that even the suggestion of inappropriate behaviour could trigger a death sentence. We're talking honour killings, sanctioned by both families and local officials. If a woman was suspected of breaking chastity, no matter how mild the offence, the solution was often swift and final, no trial, just a correction in the family name. Let's add another layer of doom, astrology. Yeah, your heart may be screaming, but the stars say otherwise. The ancient Chinese placed enormous faith in birth charts. These weren't vague horoscopes, they were intricate cosmic maps. If your elemental signs didn't align properly, the union was considered cursed. So even if two people were perfectly matched emotionally, astrologically, they could be declared a disaster waiting to happen, which again could result in the family pulling the plug, or worse. Still, lovers tried, and that's where things get kind of beautiful. Couples wrote each other secret poems, hid letters in fans, carved names into bamboo. Love, forbidden as it was, found its way through cracks. There's an old tradition of tossing poems into a river, hoping the current would carry the message to its intended. Risky? Yes. Pathetic? Maybe. But also deeply human. And yet, the more romantic you got, the more likely you were to get caught, because servants were everywhere and they talked. Gossip in the household could travel faster than wildfire. Even your own siblings could betray you to gain favour. So you start becoming paranoid. Was that sound outside your window just the wind or someone listening? If you were a noble woman, your mobility was severely limited. Upper-class girls often couldn't leave their family compounds without chaperones. They might spend their days embroidering, studying poetry, or practicing calligraphy, all within a few heavily guarded rooms. So even seeing someone face to face took layers of planning and deception. For commoners, there was more freedom. Markets, festivals, temple fairs. But even then, eyes were always watching. Society valued obedience above all. There's a quirky fact buried in all this oppression. During the Qing Dynasty, some rural communities developed a coded language called nushu, written by women, for women, often to express feelings they couldn't say aloud. Some of it was about daily life. Some of it was about longing. Love letters in disguise, passed between sleeves, stitched into handkerchiefs. That's how deep the hunger for connection ran. And still, scholars argue about it. Was love always seen as dangerous? Or were there undercurrents? Quiet approval, private exceptions, little pockets where love was tolerated if handled discreetly. Some believe parents secretly rooted for their children to be happy, even if they'd never admit it. Others think the entire system was designed specifically to crush that hope. The debate lives on, but you're not a scholar. You're someone who's tasted the first electric bite of real emotion in a world where love is synonymous with doom. You know what happens to people who fall outside the lines. You've heard the stories. Neighbours who were sent away. A girl in the next village who disappeared after she kissed the wrong boy at the Lantern Festival. No one talks about it out loud, but everyone knows. So when you see that person again, your person, you hold the moment like it's made of glass. You can't speak, you can't write, but you can look. And in ancient China, sometimes that look was the only freedom you'd ever get. You're dreaming about her again, those bound feet wrapped in embroidered silk, her eyes just barely peeking over the fan she's not supposed to be holding outside. The dream always ends the same way. Someone sees you together, shouts something you can't understand, and then the world goes dark. You wake up sweating. Because in this world, falling in love is the first step to falling apart, and for women it starts even earlier, like before she can walk. Welcome to the twisted tradition of footbinding. It begins when she's 5, maybe 6. Her mother takes her tiny feet and folds the toes under, tightly wrapping them with cloth soaked in herbs and sometimes animal blood to soften the flesh. The bones break, arch collapses, and after years of agony she has what's considered the perfect lotus foot. About 3 inches long, arched like a crescent moon, utterly useless for walking more than a few steps. Why did they do this? Because it was beautiful. Because it showed she was marriage material. Because it meant she couldn't run away. You see her hobble across the room, each step a trembling act of performance, like she's trying to stay balanced on broken glass. You want to help her, but touching her in public would be suicide. She might not even know your name, but she knows you watch her, and that's enough, for now. The deeper you get into this love story, the more you realise how little ownership she has over her own body. Her movement is restricted, her clothing is layered, stifling. Her days are filled with obedience lessons, how to serve tea, how to address elders, how to never show too much of herself. Her worth is measured in dowries and silence. This isn't just about repression, it's about containment. Ancient Chinese society was obsessed with order. Women were expected to follow the 3 obediences: obey their father before marriage, their husband after, and their sons in widowhood. The body was just another domain of control. A woman in motion was a threat, a wild card. So instead, they turned her into a symbol of elegance, modesty, and above all submission. But here's the messed up part. Despite the horror of it all, footbinding became a form of secret rebellion too. Some women used the enforced stillness to write poetry, paint, even compose songs. If they couldn't walk freely, they'd let their minds wander. One woman, trapped inside a household, might spend years crafting a love poem on a silk fan, waiting for the right moment to pass it through a crack in the wall. And yes, men fell in love with those minds. That's what makes it even harder. Love did find a way, even when wrapped in pain. There's a famous case from the Qing Dynasty. A scholar from a poor family falls for the daughter of a wealthy merchant. She's bound-footed, delicate and confined, but also brilliant. They write each other riddles disguised as academic questions. She answers everyone. Eventually the scholar proposes, formally through the right channels, but her father refuses. Says the scholar has no status, no money, no future. The girl is married off to someone else. The scholar goes mad, writes 300 poems in her memory, and disappears into the mountains. Legend says he became a wandering monk. Her fate? No one knows. Some say she died of grief. Others say she lived quietly, never speaking her husband's name. The story changes depending on who tells it. Of course, not everyone hated footbinding. Some women considered it an honour, a sacrifice for beauty, a rite of passage. In wealthier families, the pain was dulled with opium or paid servants who carried them everywhere. But still, the cost was immense. One misstep, literally, and she could be bedridden for weeks. It also meant if a girl wanted to escape her arranged marriage or meet a lover in secret, good luck. She couldn't run, could barely stand. And that's the point. The system wanted her trapped. Quirky fact. Some men collected women's shoes. Tiny, embroidered, impossibly curved. They weren't just fashion items, they were erotic tokens. In certain cases, lovers would exchange shoes instead of letters. A hidden message sewn into the lining, a single flower stitched in just the right way. So yeah, footbinding was awful. But it also became a coded language of desire. Tragic, but weirdly poetic. There's still an academic debate over who perpetuated footbinding the most, men or women. Some historians argue women enforced it to maintain social status and ensure their daughters married well. Others say men drove it with their obsession over beauty and control. The truth, as always, is probably tangled somewhere in between. Either way, love got crushed in the middle, wrapped in silk and buried beneath 1,000 layers of obedience. Now imagine her trying to see you again. She has one maid she trusts, barely. The maid smuggles a note to you during a temple festival. You read it under moonlight, heart thudding in your chest. It's short. Just a line of poetry about clouds and cranes. But you know what it means. Meet me at the back gate during lantern time. You show up, of course. You'd risk anything. She arrives in a sedan chair hidden behind curtains. She leans out for 1 second. You touch her hand. It's trembling. So is yours. A lantern floats by overhead, casting golden light across her face. And then, someone sees you. The next day your father calls you into the family hall. Your face is slapped before the first word is spoken. Your mother cries. Your brother says you're selfish. The girl? No one says her name. She's just gone. Sent to a distant province. Married off. Or worse. You're not sure if she ever existed, really. Just a pair of eyes, a soft hand, a note that smelled faintly of camphor and roses. That's the price of a moment in ancient China. That's what you pay for daring to want more. You're sitting under a tree now, somewhere on the edge of the city, just beyond where the tiled rooftops give way to mist and mountains. You're older, wiser, supposedly, but the ache in your chest hasn't gone anywhere. It just wears different clothes now. Maybe a scholar's robe, maybe a merchant's coat. You've learned to bury your feelings in books and scrolls, in the quiet echo of calligraphy brushes sweeping ink across silk. But every so often, you hear a story, one that pulls you right back into the heartbreak you tried to forget. This time, it's a tale passed from tea shop to tea house, whispered like a scandal but told like a dream. The story of Liang Shanbo and Zhu Yingtai. And if your younger self had known it, maybe you wouldn't have felt so alone. Zhu Yingtai was born into a well-off family in Hangzhou sometime during the Eastern Jin Dynasty, around the 4th century. Smart as a whip, sharper than any boy her age. But being a girl meant school was off limits. Her solution? Classic. Dress like a boy and enroll in a Confucian academy under a fake name. Easy, right? Just don't fall in love. Of course she does. She meets Liang Shanbo, a fellow student. Kind, passionate, as obsessed with the Analects as she is. For 3 years they study together, live side by side, share thoughts, jokes, and long gazes across lecture halls. But he never realises she's a woman. Not once. Blind as a bat, that guy. Eventually her parents summon her home. Marriage talks are brewing. Before she leaves, she tries to drop hints, invites him to visit her family, and maybe marry her younger sister, who suspiciously looks, sounds, and is exactly her. Liang doesn't catch on until much later, when he finally makes the trip and realises, oh, that sister is the friend he's been in love with for years. Cue the heartbreak. Zhu is already betrothed, arranged by her parents to a wealthy, politically connected man. She has no say. Liang, devastated, falls sick. Some say of heartbreak, others say of humiliation. Either way, he dies. Now, here's where it gets poetic and weird. Zhu hears of his death on the way to her wedding. She detours to his grave, wailing in grief. As the story goes, a bolt of lightning splits the earth, the grave opens up and she throws herself in. The earth closes behind her. Both lovers vanish. Later, people say 2 butterflies emerge from the grave, dancing through the sky, fluttering free, reborn together, finally. It's why they're still called the butterfly lovers. You might be thinking, that can't be real. And sure, maybe it isn't. But this story's been carved into stone, painted on scrolls, sung in operas for centuries. It's one of China's 4 great folk tales. That's how deeply the longing for forbidden love and the pain of being torn apart runs through the cultural veins. And yet, even in legend, it's clear. The price of love is death, or at least disappearance. Nobody just gets to be in love and survive it. That's not the lesson. The lesson is, love deeply, suffer beautifully, and accept your fate. Super romantic, super bleak. Here's a curious detail. Some historians believe the Zhu Yingtai figure might have been inspired by real cross-dressing women who pursued education in disguise. There are documented cases, though rare, of women sneaking into male academies and even passing civil exams. But romance? That part would have had to stay buried. Or else. And there's always debate about how much of this story is about love versus rebellion. Is Zhu Yingtai a feminist icon or a tragic puppet? Did she cross-dress for knowledge or for romance? Did she throw herself into the grave because of love, or because she couldn't stomach the marriage she was being forced into? Scholars argue about that endlessly, each interpretation peeling back another layer of longing and resistance. Either way, the story leaves a mark. You can't help but imagine the flutter of butterflies, those delicate wings beating in time with a love that couldn't breathe in the real world. You wonder if all lovers in your world are just caterpillars, waiting for the right moment to transform, or get crushed in the process. But let's not get too dreamy, because for every Zhu and Liang floating into the afterlife, there were real people punished harshly for far less. In some provinces, acting out of role, meaning a woman dressing like a man or stepping beyond her social boundaries, was considered subversion. That could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. A father might publicly disown his daughter. A brother might be forced to kill her to restore family honour. There were rules, and those rules didn't care about poetry. Still, people clung to stories like this because they offered an escape, if not in reality, then in metaphor. The idea that love could transcend gender, class, fate, even death was intoxicating, especially when your daily life was so tightly controlled that even smiling at the wrong person could spark suspicion. And now, back under your tree, you realise something strange. The more forbidden something is, the more beautiful it becomes. You're not sure if that's cultural conditioning or just how the human brain works, but either way, it's true. The heartbreak, the risk, the impossibility. It turns even a simple brush of fingers into a lifetime memory. You still carry her face in your mind, the one you lost. Not Zhu Yingtai, your butterfly. The one who never got to finish the poem she slipped into your sleeve. the one whose name you haven't said out loud in years. Maybe you'll tell her story someday. Or maybe it'll just live here, in your chest, fluttering softly every time you hear the wind move through the trees. The first thing you notice is the perfume. It's sweet but heavy, like fermented flowers soaked in wine and secrets. It clings to the air even after she's gone, leaving a trail through the garden paths, up the palace steps and into your head, where it curls up and refuses to leave. That's how it begins, your brush with danger. Because the moment you fall for a concubine, you've already lost. She's not yours, she never was. She belongs to the emperor. Let's rewind. You're a scholar official, recently promoted. Maybe you aced the civil service exams, dazzling the court with your essays on filial piety and moral order. You've spent most of your life with your nose in books, dreaming of serving the empire with honour. But now that you're in the capital, things are different. More dangerous, more golden, especially inside the palace. The concubines live in a world apart. Lavish, cloistered, tightly monitored. The emperor has hundreds, maybe thousands, depending on the dynasty. Some are daughters of noble families, others gifted by local governors hoping to curry favour. They are ornaments, political tools, wombs for hire, and in rare cases they are the emperor's favourites. You're not supposed to look at them, ever, but she looked at you first. It's accidental, probably. She's carried past in a palanquin, the curtain slips, your eyes meet. Just a second, long enough. Something passes between you that has nothing to do with rank or protocol. You feel it like a blade pressed to your neck, and then she's gone. You try to forget it. Good men don't die for glances, but then you see her again. At a court banquet this time, she's dancing, slow and deliberate, moving like ink across water. Her eyes scan the room, land on yours, linger. Now you're in real trouble. Because here's the thing about palace women. Their lives are completely out of their hands. Once they're taken into the harem, they're property. They don't leave. If the emperor favours them, they rise, sometimes to power, even influence. If he forgets them, they fade into obscurity, living out their days in quiet despair. And if they fall for someone else, that's high treason. You know the stories. Everyone does. There's Consort Zhao, who dared to exchange poems with a court musician. When it was discovered, the musician was executed by slow slicing, death by 1,000 cuts. She was stripped of rank, paraded through the capital and vanished soon after. Rumours say she was buried alive. Others say she was sent to a cold palace, a kind of royal prison where forgotten women wither like flowers without sunlight. Still, something about this new woman, this concubine with the hawthorn blossom voice, makes you reckless. You start walking the long way around courtyards, lingering near her garden at dusk. Once you pass by her maid, who drops a folded square of silk at your feet. You pick it up, trembling. It's blank at first. But when you breathe on it, letters bloom, hidden ink, a single line. If we meet in dreams, do not wake me. You're not sure whether to laugh or scream. From there, it escalates in all the worst ways. You begin to write back, carefully, in riddles and couplets, hidden inside scrolls that pass through too many hands. Every note could be intercepted. Every message is a gamble. You're not just risking your career anymore. You're gambling your life. Hers too. And here's where the system shows its teeth. The emperor, while rarely seen, is omnipresent. His spies are everywhere. Eunuchs, court ladies, even gardeners. Some serve him out of loyalty, others because the system makes betrayal the only currency left. A single whisper of suspicion could send both of you to the execution block. Still, you keep writing. One night, you find a hairpin hidden in your sleeve, a phoenix carved from jade. The message is clear. She wants to meet. You spend 3 sleepless nights planning every detail, every step. The meeting lasts 10 minutes. It's barely anything. A few words, a soft laugh, her fingers grazing yours before she vanishes again. But those 10 minutes, they ruin you. Because now you know what it's like to have something real in a place built entirely on illusion. And you also know it can't last. Historical fact. During the Tang Dynasty, one concubine, Yang Guifei, held so much sway over the emperor that his obsession with her triggered a full-blown rebellion. The Anlushan rebellion killed millions. When the emperor was forced to flee, his own guards demanded her death as the price of his survival. He agreed. She was strangled with a silk cord under a tree somewhere in the mountains. That's the kind of storm love can summon when it happens in the wrong place. But here's a strange, almost beautiful detail. Some concubines who were caught in secret love affairs weren't killed immediately. They were locked in silk chambers, soundproof, lightless, with meals passed through tiny slits. It was said that after months alone, their voices would vanish. They'd forget how to speak. Their dreams would become louder than the world. Some think it was a mercy. Others say it was a living grave. And still, scholars today argue whether concubines had any real agency. Were they passive victims or quiet power players? Some manipulated eunuchs, some brokered alliances through the emperor's ear. But love? That was the one game they couldn't win. Politics might let you play. Passion would kill you. You're more careful now. You stop writing. You avoid her eyes. You pretend it never happened. But the damage is done. She disappears from court 3 months later. No one speaks her name. You don't ask. You can't. You bury the jade hairpin under a plum tree and spend the next decade rising through the ranks like nothing ever happened. You write long essays on virtue. You marry a woman chosen for you by the ministry. You have children who will never know this version of you. But some nights, when the palace lanterns flicker just so, you swear you see her shadow. Just beyond the paper walls, just beyond the edge of memory. And you wonder if she still dreams of you, or if the dreams ended when the door closed behind her and never opened again. You hear the story in pieces, like shattered porcelain swept into a quiet corner of the palace. A guard whispers it to a kitchen maid, who tells it to a stable boy, who murmurs it while you're brushing past in the corridor. They say a young servant in the inner court fell in love with one of the emperor's concubines, and they say it ended exactly how you'd expect. Badly. No, worse than badly. Horrifically. Because in the imperial harem, love is not just forbidden, it's practically a death cult. The harem, hugong, is not what people outside imagine. It's not soft couches and gentle music. It's not a swirling sea of silken robes and perfumed laughter. It's a cage made of gold and rules and paranoia. Some of the most dangerous people in the empire live here. Not warriors, not officials, but women who have been taught that survival depends on beauty, cunning, and absolute loyalty to the man who owns them. At the top is the empress, ruling the harem with iron dignity. Beneath her are ranked consorts, imperial noble consorts, pure consorts, worthy consorts, all the way down to palace maids who scrub floors until their hands blister. And then, of course, there's the emperor himself, the sun around whom all these women revolve, whether they want to or not. Let's be clear, many of these women have never even spoken to him. They were selected based on beauty and family background, brought in during mass recruitments every few years, and then simply forgotten. Left in the inner court to wait, often for years, sometimes forever. Their days are filled with embroidery, ritual greetings, tea ceremonies, and fierce competition disguised as politeness. Their nights are long, quiet, and soaked in loneliness. Now imagine what happens when one of them, young, maybe still hopeful, starts to notice the eunuch assigned to her quarters. He's kind, respectful, brings her extra sweets when no one's looking. Maybe he reads to her from the Book of Odes, voice steady in the candlelight. Maybe he doesn't turn his eyes away when she looks at him. He's safe, or so she thinks. Because, well, he's a eunuch. That's the point, isn't it? But eunuchs were only safe in theory. Castration didn't mean emotion was removed. Some eunuchs resented their condition deeply, while others learned to live with it. Many even rose to incredible heights of power, and sometimes, rarely, there was affection, even love. Something small, slow, and dangerous, like lighting a lantern in a house full of oil. When these two, let's call them Mei and Tao for the sake of the story, are finally discovered, it's not through anything dramatic. No intercepted letters or moonlit rendezvous. It's a hairpin. A simple jade pin found in Tao's sleeping mat bearing the mark of Mei's quarters. Just one object. That's all it takes. What follows is fast and brutal. Tao is dragged from his station, accused of subverting palace discipline, and executed within days. Mei is imprisoned in the cold palace, a special section of the harem reserved for women who have fallen out of favour or committed unspeakable acts. They strip her of titles, servants, even her name. She becomes a ghost before she's even dead. Historical fact. Cold palaces were real, and they were terrifying. These were isolated buildings within the Forbidden City or other imperial compounds where disgraced women were banished, sometimes with no attendance, no heat, and no hope. There are records of women locked there for decades, slowly losing their minds. Some scratched poetry into the walls with fingernails, some turned to prayer, others simply faded. You wonder, did May know the risk? Did Tao? Or did they believe, even for a moment, that love might protect them? Quirky fact, if you can stomach the dark humour, eunuchs were sometimes judged by the completeness of their castration. If a eunuch's infraction was serious enough, an imperial doctor would be assigned to confirm that his anatomy had truly been removed. There were, disturbingly, cases where incomplete procedures led to accusations of fraud, and those eunuchs were executed. Not for the original crime, but for daring to still be too much man. So, yeah, not a lot of room for romance here. And the scholarly debate, it runs deep. Some historians argue that harem women were political agents in their own right, using favours and alliances to gain power, even manipulating emperors through affection. Others insist they were largely powerless, trapped in a ritual, machine that reduced their lives to birthing heirs or fading into exile. But in both views, love, as we imagine it, mutual, tender, voluntary, had no place. It was too human, too wild. Still, people tried, always. That's what makes the stories sting more than any execution report or edict ever could. Because you know, deep down, they were just like you, longing, afraid, reckless with hope. Back in your own life, you remember when you passed by the harem gate on the way to a ceremony. The air was thick with incense, perfumed smoke curling into the afternoon sun. You caught a glimpse of red silk behind a carved screen, just a flicker, but it stayed with you for days. You wondered who she was, if she had someone, if she was waiting for someone. You never asked, you never looked again. But sometimes, when the wind shifts through the garden pines at night, you imagine her there, holding a piece of paper she'll never send, whispering a name she'll never say out loud, still alive in the one place love could never be safe, but always found a way to bloom, if only for a breath. The black veil goes over her head before the sun rises. She can't see much through it, just shadows moving in and out of the morning haze. Her hands are folded like they were taught, stiff and obedient. She's 19 years old, recently widowed, and about to spend the rest of her life in a room that no one will speak about. Or, if her in-laws decide, she might not even make it that far. Because in your world, mourning and love do not mix. And for a widow, forbidden romance isn't just scandalous, it's deadly. You watch from the side, helpless. Maybe you're a neighbour, maybe a friend, maybe someone who dared to care too much. But you already know how this ends. Ancient China didn't do second chances, especially not for women. When a husband dies, a whole machinery of grief kicks in. Not just tears and incense, but rules. So many rules. The widow is expected to remain loyal to the dead man, not for weeks or months, but forever. This idea is called ji, or chaste widowhood. It sounds poetic until you realise what it really means. She's done. No remarriage, no flirtation, no moving on. Her life becomes a tribute to a man who, frankly, isn't even around to care, and it gets worse. In some dynasties, like the Ming, the state actually rewarded widows who refused to remarry. We're talking official plaques, titles, money sent to their families, praise carved into stone. There were government-issued chastity arches, literal monuments built to celebrate women who chose lifelong mourning over love. Imagine that. An entire public structure built just to say, she was sad forever. What a hero. But what if she wasn't? What if she met someone? A former neighbour, a cousin's friend, a travelling scholar who smiled a little too long at the market. Suddenly, that grief doesn't look so permanent, and in this world that is an incredible threat. Because a widow in love isn't just defying social norms, she's challenging the entire structure of moral order. She's stepping out of her assigned role. She's saying, I'm still a person, not just a statue of loss. And the system does not like that. Take the case of Lady Lin, a real widow from the late Ming era. Her husband died young, leaving her with 2 children. She was praised at first, refusing to remarry, raising her kids alone. But then rumours started. A male tutor was seen leaving her home too late in the evening. The whispers grew. Eventually she was brought before local magistrates and interrogated. She denied everything. They found love letters in a locked box, She was executed for violating chastity. Yeah, executed. For falling in love after her husband died. It wasn't always that brutal, of course. Sometimes the punishment was quieter. A woman caught in a new romance might be disowned, her name struck from family records. She might be locked in a room indefinitely, given only the barest food and water. Some were sent to remote temples to become nuns, whether they wanted to or not. Spiritual exile. All because they dared to hope for a second beginning. There's a fringe practice worth mentioning here, Zunfu suicides. These were voluntary and often socially pressured acts of widows killing themselves shortly after their husbands died, to prove loyalty. Yes, seriously. Some drank poison. Others threw themselves into rivers. Some burned with their husband's corpse during cremation. These acts were held up as the gold standard of virtue. And if you're wondering why someone would do that, it wasn't always pure devotion. Sometimes the pressure came from in-laws, neighbours, even local officials. There are accounts of teenage girls crying and resisting, while being led toward their husband's funeral pyre. Sometimes they were drugged first. One widow reportedly ran away multiple times before she was tied down and forced to die beside her husband's coffin. The family still got their chastity plaque. Here's the paradox. Men could remarry as soon as the burial incense cooled. Widowers weren't bound by chastity laws. In fact, it was expected that they remarry. Got to keep producing sons after all. But for women, any hint of romantic interest, even years later, meant shame, dishonour, sometimes death. You try to imagine what it must have felt like, to be trapped in mourning while your heart stubbornly kept beating, to find someone who made you laugh again, only to realise that even that was a betrayal. You couldn't wear bright colours, couldn't attend festivals, couldn't even listen to certain songs without people raising eyebrows. Grief became your identity, and anything else, especially love, was treason. But here's the twist. Some women faked it. They performed grief in public and loved in private. Letters hidden inside prayer books. Lovers disguised as hired help. A glance shared behind mourning. Veils. Some even staged their own deaths and ran off to live under new names in distant provinces. It didn't happen often, but it did happen. Love has always been clever. There's one legendary case, half history, half myth, of a widow who faked a suicide to avoid remarriage. Everyone thought she'd drowned herself in a river, but she'd actually arranged for a fisherman to take her away. She started over in a village 3 counties south, living with her lover as man and wife for 10 years before being recognised by a travelling magistrate. She was dragged back, tried for deception and sentenced to death. But according to local legend, her ghost still haunts the riverbank, weeping not for punishment, but for the years of joy she almost got to keep. And here's the academic debate. Was chaste widowhood a form of oppression or a sneaky kind of power? Some scholars argue that staying loyal gave women a rare position of moral authority. They couldn't remarry, sure, but they also couldn't be married off. They ran their households, controlled their sons, managed estates. In a rigid world, being a widow could ironically give a woman more autonomy than a wife ever had. But the trade-off? Eternal loneliness, or secrecy, or risk. So now you're standing at her memorial, maybe years later. Maybe no one remembers the real her, just the woman in white who mourned forever. You do. You remember the way she laughed when she thought no one could hear, the way her fingers trembled the first time they brushed yours, the way she chose you, even when it meant choosing death. You close your eyes. The wind shifts. For a moment you think you hear her voice. Or maybe it's just the rustle of her veil, carried on the air like a question that never really got answered. You're walking through a narrow market alley, the kind that only exists in stories. Red lanterns overhead swaying like slow pendulums, the air thick with incense and roasted chestnuts. An old storyteller is seated near the tea house, her voice cracked like old parchment. She's telling a tale you know by heart, even if you've never heard it aloud. Everyone calls it China's Romeo and Juliet, but really it's older than Shakespeare and far more haunting. You stop to listen, and for the next few minutes, the market fades away. You're with 2 young lovers, a grave, and a pair of butterflies. Liang Shambo and Zhu Yingtai, the butterfly lovers. You've heard the name, maybe even recited it in school, but sitting there, with steam curling up from your tea and the storyteller's voice sliding between shadows, it hits differently. Because this isn't a metaphor, it's a warning. Zhu Yingtai was a girl born into a world that refused to let girls do anything interesting. No school, no lectures, no long philosophical debates about the 5 Confucian relationships. So naturally, she found a loophole. Dressed as a boy, she enrolled in a Confucian academy in Hangzhou. It wasn't a prank. It was freedom stitched into every layer of her disguise. And it worked, at least for a while. That's when she met Liang Shanbo. He was everything a tragic male lead should be. Kind, intelligent, a little too noble for his own good. They became best friends, studied together, ate together, shared jokes, stories, rain shelters. 3 whole years of closeness, and not once did Liang realise he was dealing with a girl. That says something about his obliviousness, or maybe her skill. Either way, the clock was ticking. Eventually, Ju's father summoned her home, an arranged marriage looming like a sword over her head. She tried to buy time, stalling with fake illnesses and poetry about sick butterflies. Before leaving, she told Liang he should visit her house and meet her sister. He agreed, not suspecting a thing. When he finally arrived months later, the disguise was gone, the truth laid bare, and so was the future she couldn't control. She was already betrothed, locked into a marriage for her family's gain. Liang collapsed in grief, and shortly after, he died. Some say of heartbreak, others say of despair. Either way, he was buried in a quiet tomb just outside the city walls. Here's the moment everyone waits for, the part where love claws its way back. On the day of Ju's wedding procession, her carriage passed Liang's grave. She insisted they stop, got out, walked alone to the mound of earth where the man she truly loved was buried. Then, depending on the version you hear, the ground split open. A crack formed just wide enough. She stepped in and vanished. Some say she was swallowed whole by the earth. Some say she threw herself in. All agree she never left. 2 butterflies emerged from the grave, dancing above the field, fluttering side by side into the sky. It's a beautiful image, easy to romanticize. But the more you think about it, the more terrifying it becomes. Because this wasn't just love denied, it was love that had to die to exist. And the echoes of that idea still live in the bones of the culture. Butterflies became a symbol of impossible love, of souls reunited only in death, and the story became a cautionary tale. In art, theatre, opera, Ju and Liang are forever youthful, forever tragic, forever out of reach. You can fall in love, sure, just be prepared to die for it, literally. Historically, the tale is thought to originate from the Eastern Jin dynasty, though no one's sure if Ju and Liang were real people. Some scholars believe the story began as a folk legend, later picked up and polished by scholars who loved a good tragic romance. Others argue it reflects actual social tension between arranged marriage and individual desire, between social class and personal longing. It's not just a love story, it's a rebellion wrapped in a funeral shroud. And there's something a little quirky too. In certain rural villages, young people used to visit Liang and Ju's symbolic tomb before exams or marriage proposals, hoping for good luck. Some even left notes, tied to tree branches or tucked into crevices in the stone. Not prayers exactly, more like messages. Please, let me marry the one I love. Let me not die waiting. In this culture, stories like this weren't just entertainment, they were survival strategies. You couldn't say out loud that you hated your arranged marriage, or that you were in love with the village baker's apprentice. But you could recite a poem about Ju and Liang. You could hum a tune from the Butterfly Lovers opera while your parents talked dowries in the next room. You could mourn through metaphor, and the debate lives on. Some historians argue that the story is deeply conservative, that it reinforces the idea that love outside the system leads only to death. Others say it's radical, that it gave voice to generations who had none, that in telling this story, people could grieve what they were never allowed to have. You remember the first time you heard it as a child, you thought, why didn't they just run away? But now, sitting here as someone older, someone who's maybe lost something too, you get it. They couldn't run. There was nowhere to go. Not in a world that said your heart didn't belong to you. You finish your tea. The storyteller's voice trails off. People drop coins into a basket, nod, move on. You stay a moment longer looking up at the sky. 2 swallows pass overhead, silhouettes against the grey. Not butterflies, but close enough. You wonder what she would have done, your lost love, if you'd had a crack in the earth to crawl into, if both of you could have vanished together, returned to something light and wordless. no longer trapped by fathers and fortunes and the endless tightening noose of duty. But you're still here, walking the same streets, breathing the same air, and the only thing left of her is the way your chest tightens when you hear that old melody in the marketplace, the one about lovers who needed to die just to be together. You don't remember the first time you heard the word Confucius, but it's always been there, like furniture in your house, always in the corner, always quietly shaping the way people talk and think. You just didn't realise until much later that he had something to say about your love life. Specifically, don't have one. Or, if you must, make sure it's pre-approved, socially appropriate, deeply virtuous, and absolutely not based on passion. Because in ancient China, Confucian morality didn't just guide people, it nailed them into place. You sit cross-legged on a mat, listening to your teacher drone on about the 5 constant virtues. Ren, benevolence. Righteousness. Li, ritual propriety. Ji, wisdom. And Jin, integrity. And sure, these sound nice on the surface. But then comes the hierarchy. Everyone has a role. Everyone owes obedience to someone. The emperor to heaven. Officials to the emperor. Sons to fathers. Wives to husbands. And romantic love? That wasn't in the list. Love was unpredictable. Messy. Confucius didn't exactly outlaw it, but he didn't trust it either. Desire, in his view, pulled people away from duty. Harmony was the goal, not fireworks. So let's say you're a young man from a respected family, and you fall for someone just slightly outside your class, say, the daughter of a failed scholar or a merchant's niece. She's smart, kind, maybe even literate in poetry, which is rare and exciting. But she doesn't fit the mould. Your parents are already shaking their heads. Not appropriate, they say, not suitable. That's Confucianism at work, even if no one quotes the actual text. And if you think it's just your parents being dramatic, think again. The entire legal system in dynasties like the Tang, Song and Ming was saturated with Confucian ideals. The laws enforced proper conduct not just between citizens, but inside households. A child who defied a parent could be punished by the state. A wife who questioned her husband's decisions could be cast out, or worse, charged with disobedience, a legitimate legal offence. Society wasn't just discouraging you from following your heart, it had codified it into law. Still, people tried, and that's when the letters started. Tender, coded notes slipped between books or hidden in sleeves, poems filled with metaphors about moonlight and longing, a folded fan that meant, "I'm thinking of you," a strand of hair tied with silk, smuggled between servants. Love became stealthy, delicate, performed in shadows. But shadows have eyes. One misstep, and you could find yourself standing in front of a magistrate trying to explain why you were found loitering near the women's quarters at dusk. And don't think being in love gets you a lighter sentence. If anything, it makes you look less rational, less Confucian, more like a threat. Take the historical case of Pan Yue, a poet and government official during the Western Jin dynasty. He was madly in love with his wife, and wrote famously emotional poems about her, even after her death. His affection was so intense that later Confucian scholars criticised him for being too sentimental, too weak, as if love made him less of a man. It didn't help that his mourning rituals went beyond the standard. He wore her clothes, wrote dozens of memorial poems, and reportedly visited her grave so often that local villagers got uncomfortable. Romantic? Absolutely. Confucian? Not so much. Here's the kicker. Confucian scholars actually debated whether excessive mourning for a spouse could be seen as unnatural attachment. Love, when it distracted from ritual duty or the balance of the family, became a liability. Even grief had to be measured, timed, and approved. Now there's some quirky nuance here too. In the Book of Rites, a Confucian classic, it's acknowledged that affection between husband and wife can enhance the household's harmony, but only if it doesn't interfere with responsibilities. So love was allowed, barely, as long as it kept quiet and did the dishes. And of course, this all looked different depending on your social status. For peasants, Confucian rigidity was more flexible. Sometimes the village customs overrode formal ideals. Love matches happened, elopements too. But for scholars, nobility, and anyone with political ambition, you had no room to gamble with emotion. Your marriage was a transaction. Your heart, irrelevant. Modern historians debate whether Confucianism really stamped out love or just pushed it underground. Some argue that the philosophy was twisted by later dynasties into something harsher than the original teachings. Others say that the original texts were always more about maintaining order than embracing the messy stuff of life. What's clear is that for centuries the safest way to survive was to play your role and keep your heart locked tight. And so, there you are, sitting under the plum tree outside your father's study, holding a poem you'll never send. She lives in the house down the road. You see her once a week at the temple festival. You've exchanged maybe 4 words in your entire life, and yet you die for her. And that's exactly the problem, because love like this doesn't lead to marriage. It leads to scandal, to shame, to ruin. You look up at the fading sky and wonder, is there a version of this world where Confucius would have let you be happy? A version where the rules were just a little looser, the obligations a little kinder? Maybe, maybe not. But in this one you fold the poem, hide it in a hollow in the old tree's trunk and walk back to your room. You recite the 5 virtues one more time before bed, like a prayer or a warning. You say them softly, like they might hear you if you don't. You think you're being subtle, just a few glances, maybe a shared smile at the weaving loom. But your heart is 2 steps ahead of your common sense, and before you know it, you're sliding a letter between folds of silk. You tuck it into a bolt of brocade, bright crimson with gold thread cranes, and pray no one notices. The message is short. A line of verse, a time, a place, not even a name. Just enough to set your whole life on fire. In ancient China, secrets didn't just whisper through doorways, they travelled in threads. Silk wasn't just currency, it was a medium, and if you were clever enough, it could carry more than patterns. Messages passed between lovers often hid in the delicate world of textile work. A few misplaced stitches in a handkerchief, a knot pattern that looked decorative to the untrained eye but held a meaning to the intended. Embroidery wasn't just artistry, it was code. This wasn't a society built for private love. Lovers, especially forbidden ones, had to create their own methods. Letters couldn't be openly exchanged, not when family. Members watched like hawks and servants were encouraged to report inappropriate behaviour. So you got creative. Messages hidden in fan panels, a line of poetry etched so faintly into the bamboo of a brush handle that only moonlight could reveal it. One flick of curiosity, one extra second of inspection from the wrong person, and everything could unravel. You're in the middle of one of those unravelings now. The silk you sent has somehow ended up on the wrong loom, in the wrong hands. You know because your friend's cousin's sister's maid found it discarded in a laundry basket. Half crumpled, half burned. The characters are still visible. Your heart drops into your stomach. You've been sloppy. Worse, visible. That's not just risky. That's reckless. And the consequences, well, those don't wait around. In your world, if a young woman is caught exchanging private messages with a man, it doesn't matter if nothing happened. The suggestion alone is enough to bring down the house. She's deemed impure, her marriage prospects vanish, her family's status takes a nosedive. In some cases she's sent away quietly, in others not so quietly. A few bruises, a few tears. Maybe she's forced to kneel in the ancestral hall for hours, maybe days. In more extreme cases she could be ordered to take her own life, out of honour of course, because better a quiet death than a noisy disgrace. For the man, it depends. If he's from a high enough class, maybe he talks his way out, claims ignorance. If not, punishment ranges from flogging to banishment. If it involved a noblewoman or anyone linked to an official family, things get even more delicate, because then it's a political problem, not just a moral one. There's a famous incident from the Song Dynasty. A low-ranking scribe was caught sending love notes to a lady-in-waiting from a rival noble house. He didn't even get a trial. His tongue was cut out and he was thrown in prison, where he died a year later. She was sent to a nunnery, her name stricken from family records, her face erased from portraits. All over a few pieces of parchment and one shared poem. But it wasn't always so formal. More often, things ended in silence. A girl simply disappeared. A boy stopped coming to town. You heard whispers. Maybe they ran away. Maybe they didn't make it that far. You'll never know for sure. And that ambiguity, that's what makes it worse. The not knowing, the endless wondering. It sits inside your chest like a shard of glass that never shifts, never dissolves. Of course, silk wasn't the only method. There were the classic flower codes. Peach blossoms for longing, plum for resilience, lotus for purity, or mock purity, depending on how well you knew the joke. You could say everything without saying anything at all, which was useful because saying anything was the fastest way to get accused of being inappropriate. And still, people kept doing it. You kept doing it. Because silence was suffocating. And even if it only worked for a little while, even if you only got one message through, it was worth it. You remember the first time you received one. The fabric was stiff, dyed deep blue, embroidered with clouds that curled in perfect spirals. At first you thought it was just a gift. Then your fingers brushed over the edge and found a hidden fold. Inside, a single character, stitched in red thread so small you almost missed it. Wait, that's all it said. And you did. You waited under the temple bell tower for hours, heart hammering every time someone passed. She never came, but you still have the fabric. Quirky historical fact. Some lovers use the edges of books to communicate. They'd underline certain words on each page, forming sentences when read together. If you knew the title of the book and the pattern of marks, it was like a secret code layered in plain sight. Of course, if the book fell into the wrong hands, well, that's how several court officials in the late Qing dynasty were caught plotting both love affairs and small-scale rebellions. Because apparently, hearts and politics like to mingle. But let's talk debate for a moment. Some scholars argue that this covert communication was a sign of agency, that women and men alike found ways to express themselves even under heavy repression. Others argue it's evidence of just how completely personal freedom was denied. After all, when your best option is hiding poems in socks, you're not exactly living in a romantic utopia. Still, those fragments, the scraps of silk, the pressed petals, the books with their inked breadcrumbs, tell us something that laws couldn't erase. People loved anyway. They found a way, even if it was doomed, even if it was fleeting, even if it ended in ashes. And you? You walk through the market now with new eyes. Every bolt of cloth holds 1,000 secrets. Every ink stroke might be a confession. You scan the stalls looking for her face, for the red thread of possibility. You haven't given up yet. Not entirely. Because somewhere in the folds of silk, under the weight of duty and dread, there's still a part of you that believes in love strong enough to risk everything for just one more line of poetry. The bells of the temple chime softly in the mist, each one humming like a gentle reminder that time, slow and holy here, still moves forward. You're walking barefoot on cold stone, wrapped in a thin robe, head bowed low. You're not a pilgrim. You're not even supposed to be here. But you know someone who is, and you've risked everything to come because behind these walls, tucked beneath the chants and incense, is someone you can't stop thinking about. A monk. Or maybe a nun. Either way, you're already in too deep. Romance inside temples, forbidden, predictable, and also surprisingly common. Despite vows of celibacy and a lifetime dedicated to detachment, temples were not immune to the soft, gravitational pull of human connection. Maybe it's the silence that sharpens the feelings. Maybe it's the quiet discipline, the shared routines, the proximity of someone kind and good, and just a little too curious. Whatever the reason, hearts didn't always behave. You first met them during a public offering day. The temple opened its gates and allowed the local villagers to bring food and incense. You were there to light a candle for your grandmother's health. They were sweeping the steps, head shaved, face serene, eyes clear and calm. But there was something in the way they looked at you. Not desire, not yet, just recognition. As if you'd already met in a dream. Over the next few weeks you kept finding reasons to return. Extra offerings, volunteer work, maybe even a donation you couldn't really afford. All just so you could hear their voice, low and gentle, carved from the rhythm of chants and silence. You learned their name, their favourite sutra, even the way they arrange the incense cones in patterns only they understand. You fell. Slowly. Fully. And then, one night, they found you under the Bodhi tree, alone and half asleep. They knelt beside you, whispered your name like it was something ancient, and in that moment, you knew you were both lost. The rules were clear. Buddhist monastics in ancient China were expected to live by the Vinaya, the monastic code. Celibacy wasn't optional, it was central. Sex, romantic entanglement, even emotional attachment were considered distractions from enlightenment. And worse, They were signs of spiritual failure. To fall in love was to fall away from the path. But humans are humans, even in robes. There are documented cases, many in fact, of monks and nuns being expelled from monasteries for violating celibacy. Sometimes they were quietly removed and allowed to return to lay life. Other times, especially if the affair had social or political implications, the punishment was much harsher. Beatings, exile, forced labour, or public humiliation weren't uncommon. There's one famous account from the Tang Dynasty. A monk named Fazang was accused of fathering a child with a female devotee who visited the temple regularly. When the story broke, it caused a scandal. Not because people were shocked, necessarily, but because Fazang was a well-known Buddhist scholar. He was too prominent to punish quietly. So the court made an example of him, stripped him of his robes, paraded him through the city, and locked him in a remote monastery for life. But even that didn't stop others, because monastic communities weren't sealed bubbles. They interacted with society. They taught, healed, collected donations, performed funerals. Monks and nuns often came from noble families and maintained connections with relatives and local elites. Some temples became centres of secret romantic activity, not encouraged, of course, but tolerated as long as it stayed discreet. And here's a quirky detail. Some women chose to become nuns specifically to avoid marriage. For them it was a path to freedom, not devotion. Once inside the convent they could live, study, and occasionally love with more autonomy than a wife chained to her husband's household. There are poems written by nuns during the Song Dynasty, soft aching verses about longing, touch, and shared nights of warmth under the cold temple eaves. Most were never signed, but they're still read today. So where does that leave you? You start sneaking notes into their prayer books, short messages tucked between sutras. Are you real? Do you regret this? If I leave, would you follow? Their replies are careful, cryptic, but unmistakably affectionate. You are the only thought that distracts me. Every bell reminds me of the hour I met you. If I fall, will you catch me, or let me return to silence? It's not sustainable. You both know it. One day, the head abbot calls them in for questioning. Someone saw you talking. Maybe a servant noticed the notes. Maybe they slipped just once in their expression during morning meditation. Whatever it was, it's enough. They're given a choice: confess and leave the temple, or deny and be disciplined. They choose the truth, and then they're gone. You wait outside the gates, heart pounding. They don't come out. Later, you hear whispers that they were transferred to a remote monastery in the mountains, far from the city, far from you. You write letters, but you don't know where to send them. You ask the temple, and they shake their heads. They're gone. Forget them. But how do you forget someone who met you beneath a Bodhi tree and whispered your name like a prayer? Here's where the scholars get loud. Some argue that monastic love stories are rare outliers, sensational but statistically insignificant. Others say the sheer number of reported infractions suggests otherwise, that the tension between strict spiritual codes and human emotion was always simmering beneath the surface, that temples were not immune to longing. And maybe, just maybe, those love stories weren't failures of faith, but expressions of something deeper, a yearning that even monks couldn't deny. You still visit the temple sometimes, sit beneath that same tree. Sometimes you think you hear their voice carried in the wind, wrapped in the chant of bells and the rustle of robes. Maybe they've found peace. Maybe they're still thinking of you. You bow your head and whisper their name, just once, just softly, and let the sound drift up into the incense-sweet air, where no one can hear it but the sky. The brush trembles in your hand as you finish the final stroke, the black ink still wet and gleaming on the rice paper. It's just a poem, 4 lines. Nothing too bold, nothing too obvious, but the rhythm betrays you. The longing slips through anyway, like water through a cracked jar. You stare at the words, and you already know you've gone too far, because in ancient China, poetry could be art, it could be beauty, but when tangled with the wrong emotion, in the wrong hands, at the wrong time, it could be a death sentence. Poetry was everywhere, carved into stone, painted on scrolls, whispered into wine cups. It was how people expressed their joy, their grief, their cleverness. It was the highest form of self-expression in a society that didn't always let people speak freely. But within that beauty, danger lurked, especially when it came to romance. You're writing this poem for someone. Not officially, of course. On paper, it's about plum blossoms and drifting clouds. But they'll know. The pattern of characters mimics a poem they once gave you, and the metaphors are just veiled enough to slide past a censor, but still unmistakable to someone paying attention. That's how these things worked. Poetry let lovers say what society wouldn't, but it also made them vulnerable, because words can be traced. Imagine this. You're a young scholar, freshly appointed to a minor post. You've made friends with a poet in the capital, an older, more seasoned man who's known for his romantic verses. One night, over too much rice wine, you share your own poem. He laughs, then his face changes. He tells you quietly, "Be careful. If the censors see this, they won't care how pretty it sounds." You think he's being dramatic, until the next week, when you learn that another scholar, just like you, was arrested. His crime? Writing love poems addressed to a courtesan rumoured to be the mistress of a powerful general. His verses were intercepted by the general's spies. Now he's gone, vanished, no trial, just a silent removal. This isn't a one-off horror story. Throughout various dynasties, particularly under the hyper-paranoid Ming regime, love poetry was treated with suspicion. If you wrote to someone inappropriate, say, the wife of another man, a concubine of a government official, or heaven forbid, someone within the imperial court, you could be accused of qingqi, or licentious writing. That label alone could destroy your reputation, your career, even your life. There's a recorded case of a young woman during the Qing dynasty who wrote verses to a travelling musician. They never met in public, only exchanged songs through mutual friends. When her father found the poems hidden in her vanity box, he turned her in himself. The family's honour was at stake. She was confined to the home and later forced into a marriage with a much older man as punishment. The musician was arrested and sent to a penal colony. His instrument was burned in the town square as a warning. But why such harshness over something so lyrical? Because in a rigidly hierarchical society, poetry had power. It wasn't just pretty language, it was emotional currency. It carried subtext, suggestion, rebellion. A man writing poetry to a woman could be seen as staking a claim. A woman responding in verse could be interpreted as submission or encouragement. These things had consequences, especially when family reputations, inheritance, or social standing were on the line. There's a quirky historical tidbit buried in all this. Scholars used to host poetry parties, where each guest had to compose a verse on the spot using a randomly selected rhyme or metaphor. It was a way to show off intellect, sensitivity, and creativity. And sometimes, beneath all that elegance, it was a flirtation free-for-all. Entire courtships began at these parties, but if one line strayed too far, if someone's poem was too intimate, too charged, there was always someone ready to report it. Still, poetry persisted, because how else could people speak when speech was policed? A noblewoman might never be allowed to talk to a man directly, but she could leave a poem tied to a lantern. A scholar might be forbidden from contacting his beloved, but he could write a verse on a fan and pass it through a servant. Love in this world was often more ink than flesh, more metaphor than memory, and yet the danger never went away. There's a great scholarly debate about whether ancient Chinese poetry helped liberate personal emotion, or if it simply packaged longing in a form that was easier to control. Some argue that it gave people a voice in a voiceless world. Others say it created a false sense of freedom, wrapping suffocating social rules in pretty rhymes. You can see both sides, because now, here you are, sitting at your desk late at night, candle flickering low, ink drying on your brush. You've just written something that might never be read by the person it's meant for, or worse, it will be read, and someone else will read it too. You think of burning it. You think of hiding it in the baseboard of your room like a fossil. Instead, you fold it carefully, place it inside a small lacquered box and slide it into the sleeve of a robe that isn't yours. It'll reach them. Maybe, and maybe, just maybe, they'll know what it means. That somewhere in a world full of silence and rules, someone dared to love them. Not out loud, but in verse, in ink, in the spaces between the characters. You're staring into a mirror, adjusting the folds of your robe and trying not to panic. The fabric is a little loose in the shoulders, tighter in the waist than you expected, and the knot in your stomach hasn't loosened since yesterday. But you pull your hair up like a boy, tie it with a strip of dark cloth, and exhale. Tonight, you're no longer yourself. Tonight, you're him. Cross-dressing in ancient China isn't just a party trick or a disguise for laughs. It's a bold, razor-thin tightrope walk between survival and scandal. And when romance enters the equation, it goes from daring to downright deadly. But sometimes, when the person you love is separated from you by rules, walls, status, and gender expectations, slipping into another identity is the only way to be near them, even if just for a moment. You first got the idea after hearing a travelling opera troupe perform Mulan, not the Disney-fied, dragon-filled version, but the ballad passed down for centuries, a young woman disguising herself as a man to take her father's place in the army. She survives, triumphs, and only reveals herself after the war ends. It's heroic, and for you, it's instructional. If Mulan could do it, maybe you could too, because your lover is trapped, not in a tower or dungeon, but in their social role. Maybe they're a scholar, constantly flanked by servants and expectations. Maybe they're a merchant's child, too guarded to ever be seen alone. Whatever the case, you can't get close as yourself, so you become someone else. It starts with small steps. You cut your hair short, practice deepening your voice, shortening your stride. You listen to how men talk, how they sit, how they laugh too loud at jokes that aren't funny. You mimic, you learn, you slip into their world like fog under a door, and it works. The first time you walk through the city gate dressed as a boy, no one stops you. You sell it, chin up, shoulders squared, you pass for someone you're not, and you feel something shift inside, a heady mix of fear, power, and freedom. For the first time, you're not confined by the role you were born into. You can move, speak, look people in the eye. You find work at a bookshop near where your lover takes classes. It's a quiet job, ink-stained fingers, scrolls of poetry, and hours spent shelving texts you've read a dozen times. But it puts you close enough to catch glimpses, just enough to remember what love felt like before duty got in the way. Eventually you speak to them. You're careful, of course, polite, casual. They don't recognize you at first, which hurts more than it should, but they warm to you. You exchange words, then notes, then late-night walks along the canal, all while you're still hidden in your false skin. They confess something to you one night, that they loved someone once, long ago, someone forbidden, someone who disappeared. They don't say your name, but you know it, and you want to scream. Instead, you ask softly, "Would you have run away with them?" And they say, "Yes," in a heartbeat. That's when you tell the truth. Not with words, not yet, but with a gesture, a piece of jewellery they gave you long ago, a line of poetry only the two of you ever shared. Their face goes pale, then blank, then stunned. You hold your breath, and then they laugh. Just once. The kind of laugh that breaks open the world. It's not always a happy ending. In fact, it almost never is. There's a well-known story from the Ming Dynasty about a woman named Lin Xinyang who dressed as a man to join the army. Not to serve honourably like Mulan, but to stay close to her lover, a young general from a noble family. They fought side by side for months before her true identity was revealed. She was dragged before the court, accused of both deception and impropriety. She was executed. The general died soon after in battle, whether by grief or coincidence no one knows. But her name lives on, not in official histories, but in whispered stories passed through opera scripts and village legends. Cross-dressing wasn't always about love either. Sometimes it was about survival. Women who escaped abusive marriages or unwanted engagements might dress as men to travel safely across provinces. Some even joined monasteries or became wandering doctors. But when love was involved, the stakes were even higher. Here's a strange little fact. In certain regions, there were coded phrases among travelling performers and storytellers to signal when someone in their troupe was a woman disguised as a man. It was an open secret among artists, respected if never acknowledged publicly, a kind of quiet solidarity among the gender non-conforming before that was even a word. And the scholarly debates? Oh, they're heated. Some historians view cross-dressing as evidence of proto-feminist resistance, women breaking free from suffocating gender roles to claim agency, freedom, even passion. Others caution against over-modernizing the narrative. For many, it wasn't about rebellion, it was necessity, desperation, a last resort. Still, the result was the same. Ordinary people bending the world just enough to carve out a pocket of forbidden love. Back in your own life, the disguise can't last forever. Rumours grow. A neighbour asks too many questions. A child stares too long. Eventually, someone sees through the layers. A slipped voice. A loose knot. A single word that sounds too feminine. You run. You and your lover don't speak of it again. It becomes a shared silence. A closed chapter neither of you are allowed to reread. But you carry that brief, beautiful illusion inside you forever. That moment when you stood together, unmasked, unafraid, and knew you were seen. Now, you keep the clothes folded in a trunk under your bed, not out of shame, but as proof that for a while, you weren't just who the world said you had to be. You were braver, you were in love, and you were free. The first time it happens, it feels harmless, maybe even sweet. You're sick with a spring fever, sweating and shivering under blankets embroidered with faded dragons, and your family's household maid brings you a cup of honeysuckle tea. She's quiet, always has been, barely more than a shadow gliding through the halls, carrying trays, folding bedding, lighting incense. But she looks at you for a little too long, and her fingers brush yours when she hands you the cup, and that's it. The spark catches. In ancient China, where social lines are thicker than palace walls, falling in love with a servant, or being a servant who dares to love upward, isn't just frowned upon, it's suicidal. Because love here isn't about two people, it's about hierarchy, status, property. And in this structure, servants weren't people in the full sense. They were extensions of the household, like furniture or silver bowls. Caring for one was one thing. Loving one? That was crossing a line the law itself might draw in blood. The line, by the way, isn't subtle. It starts with Confucian codes that carve society into layers. Father over son, husband over wife, master over servant. It's reinforced by legal codes from dynasties like the Tang and Ming, which specify punishments for illicit relationships between people of different status. And while the law was often more concerned with women corrupting male servants, the reverse, any emotional entanglement between master and maid, was scandalous enough to ruin an entire family. And yet, it happened. Of course it did. Sometimes it began in childhood. Two kids growing up under the same roof, one a master's child, the other a young servant assigned as a companion. Play turned to friendship to something more. Sometimes it was the quiet, older maid who offered comfort when a parent shouted too loud, or illness darkened the halls. Sometimes it was the stable boy with the bright eyes, slipping apples to the lonely daughter of the house. However it started, it was doomed from the first glance. You learn this quickly. The first time your father sees you talking to her too casually, laughing, standing too close, he says nothing, just raises an eyebrow. But you know that look. A few days later, she's reassigned to the laundry quarters, far from your wing of the estate. You don't see her for weeks. When you do, she doesn't look at you, and that silence is worse than any punishment. There's a story passed around, half fact, half legend, about a concubine named Ruo Lan during the Ming Dynasty, who fell in love with her personal servant. He was literate, clever, taught her to write poetry in secret. When their relationship was discovered, through a series of suspiciously poetic notes hidden in a bamboo scroll box, the man was executed. Not just dismissed. Executed. His body left at the city gate as a warning. Ruo Lan, stripped of her rank and forced to live out her days in silent exile. You'd think people would learn, but they didn't, because affection doesn't care about status. Love doesn't ask to see your family registry. What's quirky and heartbreaking is that some households tried to preemptively stop these situations by separating young servants by gender, banning certain maids from even speaking to their masters without a third person present. Wealthy families sometimes selected older, unattractive servants specifically for their daughters to avoid distraction, as if attraction could be planned around. And yet, there are exceptions, rare, whispered ones. In the late Qing dynasty, a few records show upper-class men marrying former maids. It wasn't common, and it usually required the servant to be freed and officially reclassified as a commoner first. Even then, it, caused waves, extended families protested, inheritance rights got messy. And the bride's background was often erased in official records to avoid scandal. Still, it happened. There's a debated case about a provincial magistrate named Wen Liang who married his former maid, claiming she had the virtue of a scholar's wife and the soul of a poet. His peers mocked him, his parents disowned him, and his career stalled. But their letters survived, sweet, clever, and deeply affectionate. Whether the romance was worth the price, that's harder to say. So, back in your world, how do you carry love like this? In secret, mostly. You slip letters into her laundry basket, folded into starching instructions. You ask her to deliver your ink brush, just for a moment together. You invent reasons to cross the garden while she's tending chrysanthemums. And every time you do, you risk her life more than your own. Because if you're caught, you'll be punished, maybe confined, maybe shamed. But she could be beaten, sold, branded as unfaithful, even if nothing happened. In some dynasties, the accusation alone was enough. No need for proof, just suggestion. That's all it took. And yet she smiles when she sees you. Soft and tired and maybe just a little amused at how clumsy you are about it all. You talk about nothing, weather, food, the sound of cicadas outside your window, and it feels like the only part of your day that's real. The weight of it builds over time, not the romance, the risk. Every moment you sneak, every word you exchange, you're pulling tighter on a cord that could snap and slice you both. And yet, you keep going. Because this love isn't performative, it isn't strategic, it isn't about status, it's just you. The scholarly debate naturally splits down the middle. Some argue that servant-master romances were exploitative by nature, always unbalanced, always shaded by power. Others point out that some of these relationships, especially those that turned into actual partnerships, show a glimpse of agency and emotional equality rare for the time. Both are probably true, depending on the people involved. But none of that matters when she brings you tea again. Just like the first time, her hand lingering for half a heartbeat too long. It's the same tea, the same cup, but now it tastes like memory, like danger, like love. You drink it anyway. The walls of the palace aren't just high, they're listening. You've known this since your first day as a junior clerk in the Ministry of Rights. Every conversation echoes a little too long, every door seems thinner than it should be, and there's always someone just out of sight. But what you don't learn until later is how quickly a romance, real or fabricated, can become a weapon. Love in the wrong place at the wrong time isn't just scandalous, it's treason. And when someone wants you out of the way, all they have to do is suggest that your feelings wandered where they shouldn't have. That's what happens to you. You think it starts as a rumour, a passing whisper during a banquet maybe. Someone mentions that you've been seen speaking too warmly to the wife of a regional governor, which is technically true. You exchange pleasantries during a poetry contest. She complimented your calligraphy. You bowed. That was it. But now, in the mouths of your enemies, that becomes something else entirely. She leaned too close. He bowed too slowly. I heard there was a letter. None of this is real, but reality is irrelevant. In the shadowy undercurrent of imperial politics, truth is what people can be made to believe, and love, especially love between a court official and a nobleman's wife, is the perfect scandal. You try to brush it off. Surely no one would take it seriously. But then your clerkship is paused for investigation. Your name disappears from guest lists. Servants in the palace stop bowing to you. One morning you go to retrieve a scroll from the Hall of Records and find that your desk has been emptied. Someone else is sitting there now, smiling. It's not about the woman. You realise this slowly. She's just a prop, a thread to tug. The real target is you. Because you've been rising too fast, speaking too boldly, gathering too many allies, and the people above you have noticed. They need a reason to remove you without causing a stir, so they make one. A fabricated love affair, a moral failure, an accusation of romantic betrayal against both your duty and the state. Because in this world, the personal is political. There's precedent for this, of course. You've studied history. You remember the case of Chancellor Wei, accused of seducing a prince's concubine. He swore it wasn't true, no evidence ever surfaced. But he was exiled anyway, his estate seized, his son stripped of rank. The concubine? Forced to commit suicide, her body buried without ceremony. The court documents don't even name her. Just woman of questionable virtue. The implication. She wasn't a person anymore. She was a liability. And here's the worst part. Once the accusation of romantic misconduct is attached to your name, it sticks like smoke in silk. People hesitate to speak with you. No one wants to be associated. Even your closest allies turn polite but distant. Your family sends word to keep a low profile. Your sister, who once bragged about your position, now avoids mentioning your name in public. It doesn't matter that nothing happened. You didn't fall in love. You didn't write letters. You didn't cross any lines. But someone decided to say you did. And that's enough. And while you're under investigation, they don't even ask about the alleged affair. Not directly. They ask about your schedule, your associates, your opinion on last season's tax reforms. It's all a performance. They don't need proof. They need silence from you. Compliance. They want you to know how quickly a personal moment, real or invented, can unravel a lifetime of careful work. And the truly cruel thing? You start to wonder, what if you had written that letter? What if you had followed that spark of interest when she smiled at your poem? Would that have made all this feel more worthwhile? If you're going to be punished for a crime, shouldn't you at least commit it? But that's not how this place works. Here's a grimly fascinating footnote. During the Song Dynasty, a law was passed that allowed high-ranking officials to be dismissed if they were involved in romantic corruption. A vague term that included extramarital affairs, inappropriate courtships, or even appearing too emotionally attached to someone outside of marriage. It was less about morality and more about appearances. A romantic scandal made the court look weak, so anyone involved was disposed of quickly and without much fanfare, and sometimes it wasn't even about rivals or enemies. Sometimes it was about control. If you served the emperor and he suspected you of harbouring affection for someone in his inner circle, say, a dancer, a consort, even a favoured court musician, you could be accused of coveting royal property. Yes, people were royal property. Loving the wrong one was a betrayal of the throne itself. There's a debate among scholars about whether these accusations were mostly tools of political sabotage or genuine moral enforcement. But the effect was the same. Love became dangerous. Even the suggestion of it could be enough to end you. Back in your own life, you sit in a guest house near the edge of the city, under something they've called temporary suspension, which is polite code for exile without paperwork. You're not in chains, but you're not free either. You're in limbo. You replay every interaction in your mind, the conversation, the tone, the glance. You wonder if she's been accused too, if her husband suspects anything, if she's even safe. You'll probably never know. You start writing letters, not to her, not even to protest your innocence, but to yourself. Trying to hold on to the version of you that once believed merit and character mattered. That version is slipping away, replaced by someone more cynical. Someone who understands now that love, even imaginary love, is a tool in the wrong hands. The accusation never fully goes away. After a few months you're allowed to return, but not to your original post. You're given a minor role in a distant district. The message is clear. You've been marked, and marked people don't rise again. But you take the job, you smile, you bow, and inside you begin writing again, this time not letters but history, quietly, carefully, because maybe someday someone will want to know what it really cost to fall in love, or to be accused of it. You're running, not metaphorically, actually literally running. Down a narrow dirt road lined with swaying, bamboo past the old rice paddies that shimmer under the moonlight, breath hot and uneven in your throat. She's beside you, clutching the hem of her skirt, eyes wide, cheeks flushed with something between terror and freedom. You're not supposed to be here. Neither of you are, but you're doing it anyway, because you've made the decision that people in your world almost never get to make. You're eloping. In ancient China, elopement wasn't romantic, it was ruinous. When you ran off with someone, you weren't just disrespecting your family, you were tearing the social fabric thread by thread. You were rejecting the will of your ancestors, ignoring the teachings of sages, and tossing aside every Confucian lecture your parents ever drilled into your skull. Love wasn't a reason, it was an excuse, and if you got caught, there wasn't much mercy waiting on the other side. But let's rewind a bit. You met her in a garden during Lantern Festival. You remember the colour of her sleeves, seafoam green, embroidered with tiny cranes, and the way her voice dipped when she said the word freedom, like it was a spell no one had ever let her say before. You shouldn't have spoken. You shouldn't have looked. But one moment turned into two into secret poems, and those into late-night rendezvous by the riverbank, where frogs croaked like tiny gossips and every rustling branch made your heart stutter. Then her family made a match for her, a wealthy merchant 10 years older, known for his stinginess and his bad temper. She begged. They refused. Her tears meant nothing. Dowries had been exchanged. Astrologers had confirmed compatibility. It was done, or so they thought. You told her you would take her away. She laughed at first. Where would we go? She asked. Anywhere, you said. And you meant it. Because you were in that dangerous, euphoric space where love made the impossible feel manageable. And so, here you are, running. Of course, you had no real plan. Just a vague idea of a distant village where no one knows your name and a friend of a friend who might help you find work. You have no papers, no family seal, no blessing. Just a silk pouch of coins and 2 hearts that haven't quite learned how heavy consequences can be. Because when word gets out, and it always does, it doesn't just haunt you, it scorches everything. Her family sends messengers, threatens your family, offers a bounty for her return. Your parents are humiliated. Your younger sister's engagement is suddenly cancelled. No one wants to marry into a scandal. You become that son, the shameful one, the one who threw everything away for a girl, and for her, it's even worse. If they catch her, she'll be labelled buxiaonu, an unfilial daughter, a disgrace. She may be disowned, or forced into servitude to repay the bride price. In extreme cases, runaway brides were dragged home and subjected to ritual punishment, made to kneel for hours before, ancestral tablets, or paraded through town in chains as a warning to other girls. There are even accounts of eloped women being forced to drink poison to restore honour, their deaths brushed aside as private matters. And yet, this still happened. Often enough to be mentioned in folk songs, to be gossiped about in the corner of markets, to be feared and romanticised in equal measure. There's a famous ballad from the Song Dynasty, the Westgate Runaways, about a butcher's daughter and a travelling tea seller who fled together, only to be caught at the city gate. She was returned, married off the next day. He was beaten so badly he couldn't walk again. The ballad ends with her singing from her marriage bed, promising to find him in the next life. Quirky detail. In some villages there were unofficial safe houses for eloping couples, often run by widows or retired midwives, where young lovers could hide for a few nights before disappearing deeper into the countryside. These places weren't legal, of course, but they were protected by a kind of communal sympathy. After all, not everyone believed that marriage should be dictated by charts and coin. But the official stance, elopement was deviant. The legal codes of the Qing dynasty explicitly penalised both parties, with harsher punishments for the woman. Men could sometimes plead impulsiveness. Women were assumed to be seduced, corrupted, or rebellious, which meant naturally that women paid the steeper price. Historians still argue over the root of that imbalance. Was it about chastity, control, economic loss? Some say it was about family property. Losing a daughter meant losing her bride price. Others say it was ideological. Female obedience was the cornerstone of moral virtue. Break that, and the whole system looked shaky. And you? You're not thinking about any of this as you rest in a cramped barn outside a strange village, her head on your shoulder, both of you trembling with adrenaline. You're thinking about how her breath smells like chrysanthemum tea, how the stars look closer out here, how this might be the last peaceful moment you ever have, because dawn is coming, and with it, decisions. Will you keep running? Find work under false names? Beg some village elder to shelter you? Or will you turn back, face the fire, and hope that your love survives the smoke? Either way, you know something now that you didn't before. Love may be tender, but it's not soft. Not here. Not in this world. It's a knife you carry quietly, a dream that blisters if you hold it too tight. And tonight, as you drift off in that hay-scented barn, your fingers still linked in hers, you tell yourself that whatever happens, at least you didn't just watch her walk away, you ran. They say you shouldn't look at the moon too long on Ghost Festival night, that it's a mirror for the dead, those who wander, those who wait, those who haven't quite let go. And if you stare too long, they might mistake you for one of them. It's superstition, of course, just old stories wrapped in candle smoke and the rustle of joss paper. But tonight, as you kneel beside your small offering table, rice, a cup of wine, a paper lotus floating in a bowl, you feel something, a shift, a presence. And when the wind brushes your cheek like a familiar touch, you don't flinch, because you know who it is. She died 3 years ago, or maybe it's been 4. You've stopped counting the seasons, it doesn't matter. What matters is that she never left. You still hear her voice in the rustle of leaves, still see her face in the steam rising from your morning tea. You never married. How could you? She was the only one who saw you, really saw you, in a world that demanded masks. You were supposed to forget. Instead, you kept speaking to her, and she answered. Ghost lovers, they call them, spirits of the departed who return to the ones they left behind, sometimes for closure, sometimes for vengeance, and sometimes, impossibly, for love. In ancient China, the line between the living and the dead was less a barrier and more a veil. Paper thin, pliable, especially if passion was involved. You never told anyone, of course. What could you say? That you heard her footsteps in the garden at night? That your oil lamp flickered in time with her old laugh? That your dreams grew vivid enough to stain your waking hours? People would call you mad, or cursed, or worse, haunted. But you know the truth. She's still here, and the part of you that's still hers, it never stopped waiting. There's a long tradition of love beyond the grave in Chinese folklore. Tales of ghost brides and spectral suitors, lovers separated by death and reunited in dreams. Some stories end sweetly. The two are reborn in the same village, destined to find each other again. Others end with tragedy, the living dragged into the underworld, unable to return. One of the most famous is the tale of Ni Xiaoqian, the ghost maiden who falls in love with a mortal scholar. She's trapped in servitude to a tree demon, forced to lure men to their deaths. But when she meets Ning Kaichen, she spares him, falls for him, helps him escape. He in turn performs rituals to free her spirit. Eventually she's reborn, and they marry. The story is half horror, half romance, and all yearning. But not all ghost lovers are as noble. There are darker stories, like the bride who died before her wedding day, and returned every night to lie beside her betrothed. He welcomed her at first, comforted by her presence, but over time she grew colder, hungrier, and eventually he withered and died, smiling as he passed, reunited with her in the afterlife, or devoured by her sorrow. Depends on who's telling it. Quirky historical fact. During the Qing Dynasty, families sometimes arranged minghun, ghost marriages, between two deceased individuals, or between a living person and a dead one. The idea was to satisfy a restless spirit or fulfill a broken betrothal. These ceremonies included real dowries, paper offerings, and even guests. The newlyweds might be buried together or joined symbolically through ancestral tablets. Sometimes these ghost spouses were believed to provide blessings, or, if neglected, misfortune. In a few cases, living spouses took their ghost marriages seriously. They remained celibate. They left offerings. They spoke aloud to the air beside them as though their partner still sat across the table. Love, once bonded, even by death, was not so easily severed. Back in your world, you did none of that. No formal ritual, no contract. Just late nights, soft prayers, and the ache that bloomed in your chest when her perfume, jasmine and cedar, lingered in the air long after the room had gone still. You know she's waiting, not angrily, not jealously, but with that same quiet stubbornness she had in life, the same look she gave you when she first said, "If this world won't let us be together, maybe the next one will." You light incense. You set out a bowl of sweet red bean soup, her favourite. You whisper her name, and for a moment the shadows in the room seem to lean in, listening. And here's the part no one talks about. Ghost lovers don't always want to be free. In some stories, they refuse rebirth. They linger because this tether to a person, to a memory, is all they have. They choose haunting over forgetting, not out of spite, but out of love too deep to dissolve. Scholars still debate whether these tales reflect actual beliefs or just metaphors for grief that refuses to end. Either way, they feel real when you're in them. You lie down, eyes heavy, and dream of her again. She's sitting by the lake where you first kissed. The water is still, her hair is loose. She smiles and says, "You're late." You sit beside her and say, "I was afraid," and she replies, "I waited anyway." You wake with the taste of her name in your mouth, your pillow damp with tears you didn't know you shed. Outside, the sky's just beginning to turn pale. The paper lotus on your offering bowl is burned down to ash. You don't know if she'll come again, or if this was the last visit. But you do know this: not every forbidden love ends when the heart stops beating. Sometimes it lingers, walks beside you, breathes with you, and sometimes, in the hush between midnight and dawn, it whispers, "I never left." You sit in the courtyard of a country estate, sipping a cup of watered-down wine that tastes like regret and rain. The pines rustle overhead, their needles hissing like they know something you don't. And across from you, sitting upright, eyes guarded, robe too fine for this dusty province, is a prince. Not the prince, but close. A fifth son, technically. Someone who shouldn't matter in the grand scheme of dynastic succession. But the problem is, he does. And the bigger problem, you're in love with him. You didn't plan on this. Of course you didn't. You were assigned as his tutor, or maybe a steward, sent from the capital to help refine his literary talents during his quiet exile from court life. The kind of polite punishment that smells like disgrace, but wears a smiling mask. You were supposed to teach him calligraphy, brush up on the Confucian classics, maybe keep him out of trouble. What you weren't supposed to do was fall into something far more dangerous than ink and scrolls. Because loving a prince, especially as someone far below him in rank, status and fortune, isn't just a problem. It's an absurdity. It's the kind of mistake people don't survive. He's clever though, and bored, and just lonely enough to entertain your company past the hours when the rest of the household sleeps. He doesn't ask many questions at first, just listens. You tell stories of the city, of the latest court gossip, of a scandal involving an imperial concubine and a misplaced jade comb. He laughs, but there's always something behind his eyes, some tension, some hunger to be more than just a royal footnote. Eventually it becomes routine. You meet in the garden after evening meal, walking slowly through the moonlit paths, reciting poetry, never quite brushing hands. It's all very proper, until it isn't. Until one night he says, "I envy you." You laugh. Because how could someone with royal blood envy you? You, who live by someone else's orders, who'll be married off soon to someone you don't even like, who wear borrowed robes and speak only when spoken to. He says you can feel things without consequence. You don't correct him. But inside you're thinking, no, I can't. Not when the thing I feel is you. The days pass and the bond deepens. You write verses for him, unsigned, folded into his books. He answers with subtle commentary during lessons, praising a line too specifically, smiling just a little too knowingly. No one else notices. That's the art of it. But then there's a knock at the door. A messenger from the capital. The prince's presence is requested. Or rather, required. Something's changed in the imperial court. A brother has died. A cousin has been discredited. Suddenly this prince, the forgotten one, the exile, is a contender. He looks at you that night with a softness that breaks your ribs. He says, "Come with me." Not as a lover, not even as a friend, but as a shadow, an advisor, a ghost of affection in a place where such things have no names, and you consider it. You do. You imagine a life behind palace walls, standing always 5 steps behind, biting your tongue as he courts alliances and marries for diplomacy. Maybe you'd still meet in secret, for a while, but the risk would grow. Every whisper, every glance would tighten the noose around both your necks, because royal blood does not mix with common hearts. That's not cynicism, that's policy. In the Tang Dynasty, there was the case of Princess Gaoyang, daughter of Emperor Taizong. She fell in love with her servant. They planned to flee together. Someone found a letter, half burned, half preserved. That was enough. The servant was executed. She was placed under house arrest for the rest of her life. Her name became a cautionary tale. In the Qing dynasty, there were rumours, whispers really, of a prince who kept a male lover hidden among his guards. Nothing proven, nothing written. But both men vanished from court records in the same year. Just a gap where lives should be. Quirky detail. In the early Ming dynasty, certain emperors were so paranoid about unsanctioned romances in the palace that they employed virtue spies, eunuchs assigned not to protect but to observe. They'd report any behaviour that suggested attachment. Long conversations, repeated gifts, shared meals. The punishment wasn't always execution. Sometimes it was something worse. Separation. Reassignment. Erasure. You remember that now, sitting across from him, the future pressing in from every direction. He asks again, "Will you come?" And you want to say yes, you really do. But instead, you shake your head, because you know something he doesn't. You know that love in his world is currency, and you have none to spend. The scholars argue whether royal romances were ever real, whether affection between people of such different stations could be genuine, or if one side was always imagining more than the other. But does it matter, when the cost is the same? You part that night without ceremony, no final kiss, no farewell letter, just the slow fade of candlelight as he disappears into history. Years later, you hear his name again. He rose, then fell. A brief moment of influence before another faction took over. He married twice, had children, wrote poetry late in life, one verse about a forgotten tutor and a garden full of white jasmine. You pretend not to know it's about you, but sometimes you dream of that garden, the way the moon casts silver threads across his cheek, the sound of his laugh when you quoted that terrible love poem, the feeling that, for one impossible second, love had bent the rules of the world, just long enough for you to believe it could last. It starts with a poem, doesn't it always? But this one isn't folded into a sleeve or whispered under a fan. This one is published, inked onto crisp new paper, carefully typeset, slipped into the latest edition of a literary gazette. It's called Lotus Blooming in Winter, and it reads like a love letter disguised as a seasonal reflection. Anyone who's never known longing sees only pretty metaphors, snow resting on petals, frost melting under breath. But anyone who has loved someone they weren't supposed to, they know. They read between the lines, they hear the heartbeat underneath. And that's exactly the problem. Because in this dynasty, let's say we're in the High Ming, at the height of bureaucracy, suspicion, and poetic scrutiny, you can lose your life not just for writing something romantic, but for writing it to the wrong person, or writing it too well, or having it interpreted by someone with political ambition and too much free time. You're not even the one who wrote the poem, you just passed it along. Maybe you're a scholar, a copyist, a member of a poetry club that meets on moonless nights to share verses and quietly roast the government in metaphor. Someone gives you the poem, says, "Deliver this," and you do. You bring it to the recipient, a low-ranking noble's daughter, or perhaps a young consort at court, and that's all it takes. You don't even know who wrote it. But within days, a stir begins. It starts with whispers, then inquiries, then you're summoned. "Do you know what this poem means?" they ask. You want to say, yes, it means someone's heart is full. But instead, you say nothing. Because what it really means, what they think it means, is rebellion. In this world, metaphors are landmines. A lotus can mean purity, or it can mean hidden intentions. Snow might suggest sadness, or the cold cruelty of imperial rule. A winter bloom, that might be interpreted as a symbol of survival against oppression. And if someone decides the poem is a veiled critique of the emperor, or worse, a message between lovers in high places, then that's it. You're implicated. Historically, there are actual cases of poems being used as evidence in trials. During the reign of the Jijing emperor, an entire family was executed after a love poem, written by a teenage son to a palace maid, was discovered by a eunuch and misread as a political code. The poem contained a line about a jade chamber's silence and the dragon's shadow turning cold. Pretty standard poetic stuff, but officials interpreted it as a criticism of the emperor's reclusive habits and declining health. That was enough to charge the boy with sedition. His family, guilty by association. Even stranger, during the Qing dynasty, the imperial court once banned a popular poetry collection retroactively, after someone in power decided one of its metaphors hinted at anti-Manchu sentiment. Copies were seized, editors punished, and one poor apprentice, who had merely set the blocks for printing, was sent to a labour camp. So yes, your heart might be pure, your intentions might be soft as spring rain, but your poetry, that can get you killed. And still, people write. Because when everything else is censored, your actions, your choices, your love, words become the last escape hatch. But you're not escaping now. You're standing in the centre of a small, cold room, while two minor officials leaf through your belongings. One finds a slip of paper in your satchel. It's not the poem, just a verse you scribbled from memory, but that's enough. They share a look, a nod. Your breath freezes in your throat. You're detained, Not tortured, not yet. Just kept. For questions. For clarity. They don't need a confession. They need a scapegoat. You think of her. Whoever she was. The one the poem was meant for. Maybe she never read it. Maybe she read it and smiled and never thought of you again. Or maybe she's waiting, terrified, because she knows that a poem addressed to her could be used to destroy you both. The days blur. The room stays cold. The food is sparse but not cruel. The guards are polite. That's worse, somehow. Because you know this isn't about justice. It's about performance, about control. Someone will be punished, and your name was simply drawn from the stack. And here's the bitterly funny part. Even now, you still remember the poem. The rhythm of it. The brush strokes. The last line. If a bloom survives winter, will it still know spring? You didn't write it, but you might die for it. Eventually the magistrate decides your fate. There's no trial, just a sealed judgment passed down. You're not executed. That would draw attention. You're relocated. A forced reassignment to a rural province so obscure it doesn't appear on half the maps. A poetic punishment, really. Exile wrapped in bureaucratic ribbons. As you leave the city, hunched in the back of a supply cart, you watch the rooftops fade. Somewhere behind those tiles and smoke and guarded walls, someone might still remember your name. Or maybe just your verse. Here's where the scholars start debating again. Some argue that these poetic scandals were exaggerated. Sensationalized stories meant to stoke fear, like political ghost tales. Others believe they were more common than we realize, hidden in dusty court records labeled disciplinary actions or moral violations. Either way, the lesson is clear. Love in ancient China didn't always need a kiss, or a glance, or a hand held in the dark. Sometimes all it needed was a metaphor. Years pass, you live in your exile, you plant vegetables, you teach local children to read, you recite poems to yourself when the fields are quiet. No one remembers your scandal. New ones have taken its place. But one day, a travelling merchant arrives carrying books. Among them, a slim volume of anonymous verses, and there it is. Your poem. Lotus blooming in winter, slightly altered, published quietly. You run your fingers across the page, no name, no justice. But still, the word survived. So maybe love didn't win, maybe you didn't either. But the poem did. The wind carries dust across the plains, a gritty whisper that coats your robes and sticks in your teeth. The horizon is endless, sky and steppe bleeding into one another, 1,000 shades of gold and grey. You weren't born here. You don't speak the language well, and yet you're standing in the shadow of a yurt, holding a bowl of fermented mare's milk, nodding respectfully to a man whose ancestors once rode with Genghis Khan. Because love brought you here, or more precisely, the ghost of love, and the fallout of empires that still haven't finished collapsing. You fled the south weeks ago when it became clear that your presence was no longer useful. Your family had supported the wrong faction in the wrong rebellion, and suddenly your name was on a list. You didn't wait for the knock on the door. You packed what you could and ran north, beyond the walls, past the farms, into territory once ruled by Mongols and now governed by people who neither like nor trust you. You thought you'd be killed, or at least exiled further, but you were lucky, or cursed, because you ended up in a town where they remembered the stories, the old ones, about the princess who fell in love with a Khan's son, or the Han official who married a Mongolian bride and was never seen again. Stories where love crossed borders, and then broke. You never meant to fall for her. Let's be clear about that. She's a horsewoman. Bold, scar-smooth, with hands that smell of leather and grass. She laughs with her whole face. She calls you bookworm and teases you for your awkward saddle posture. You only meant to stay a few nights, trade work for shelter, maybe barter some scrolls. But she watched you fall off a horse once and then helped you up. And somehow, that was the beginning. She's not like the women you knew in the cities. She wears her hair loose and rides without permission. She asks questions you're not used to answering. Questions like, what do you miss? And did you love her? And maybe the wind, or the firelight, or just the fact that no one here knows who you used to be, makes it easier to tell the truth. But you know this won't last. Because even though the Yuan dynasty is long gone, the memory of its rise, and its violent fall, is still tangled in every strand of politics and culture. Even now, a Han and a Mongol together? Not simple, not acceptable. The scars of conquest and rebellion run deep. and while your hosts may smile at you, they never quite let down their guard. There's an older woman in the village who eyes you sharply every time you're near your lover. One night, she mutters that your presence is a bad omen, that the last time a southerner fell for one of their own, it ended in bloodshed. You want to ask her for the story, but you never get the chance. Instead, you find yourself caught in a game much older than either of you, a delicate dance of alliances, suspicion and old loyalty. And in that dance, love is a misstep. There's a historical echo here, of Princess Wencheng sent by the Tang Dynasty to marry the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo, not for romance but diplomacy. Their union was dressed in silk and rituals, but it was an exchange, a contract. And those stories claim she brought culture, religion and peace. No one really knows if she loved him, or if she simply endured. Love is not often recorded in royal histories, just lineage. And then there's the tale of Arugtai, a Mongol noble, during the Ming Dynasty who was said to have taken a Han scholar's daughter as his concubine. She bore him sons, and when he was killed in battle, her family tried to rescue her. She refused, called them strangers, said she'd rather die than return to a house that never let her choose. The fringe fact. Some Mongol tombs uncovered in the north show signs of mixed burial. Han and Mongol remains laid side by side, their bones entwined. Scholars debate whether this was love or captivity. The grave tells no secrets, only that the two died close, together. Back in your own story, you can feel the eyes turning, the smiles fading, the whispers growing louder. It happens the day you're summoned by the local chieftain. You're offered tea. You're thanked politely for your help with translations and scroll repairs. Then you're told to leave. She's betrothed, they say. You were a kindness in winter, but now spring has come. You want to argue, to shout, but you don't, because you're not from here. You have no say. She doesn't cry. She doesn't plead. She just looks at you like a wound she chose not to treat. I told you, she says softly. We don't get to want things. Not here. You leave that night. She watches you ride away but doesn't follow, and so you wander again. You tell no one your name. You don't write. You don't speak of her, though sometimes, when the wind whistles just right through mountain passes, you hear her voice in the air. Scholars will say that post-Yuan China was a fractured place, that interethnic marriages were discouraged, sometimes even outlawed, that the union between a Mongol and a Han was rarely without friction. But you know it's simpler than that. It wasn't politics that broke you. It was the quiet return of an old truth. Forbidden love in any era is still love, still worth the risk, and still doomed to vanish like smoke over the steppes. Years later, in a border village, you see a rider gallop past, her hair like a black banner, her smile fierce, laughing at the sky. She doesn't look back, but you do, and that's enough. The gates of the forbidden city glide shut behind you with a sound like a blade sliding home. It's not loud. It doesn't need to be. The silence afterward is what cuts deepest. Inside these walls, love is less than a whisper. It's a liability, a curse, a dangerous luxury for people who don't understand the rules. You've just arrived, summoned to serve as a junior official in one of the lesser departments. Ritual inventory, maybe, or imperial documentation. Something with scrolls, something safe. You think it's an honour. You think you'll rise. But what you don't realise yet is that no one leaves here the same, especially not the ones who fall in love. The Forbidden City isn't just a palace, it's a world, a maze of halls and chambers, courtyards and corridors, echoing with footsteps and secrets. The people here don't speak, unless spoken to. They bow too quickly, smile too rarely. Everything has a rhythm, a protocol, a code. And beneath that code, something else churns, something dangerous. You meet him in the records hall, a clerk like you, or maybe not just like you. His robes are newer, his accent polished. You sense he's connected to someone important, but he treats you like an equal, which is the first danger. He borrows your inkstone one day, thanks you with a nod that lingers too long. The second time, he stays late with you in the archive. You exchange comments about a poorly written edict. You laugh. That's the third mistake. It's never dramatic, not at first, just shared glances, carefully folded notes tucked into sleeves. One evening walk in the garden after the lamps are lit and the courtiers have retreated. The city within a city wraps itself around you like silk, and silk can strangle. because every love story here ends in silence. Or blood. You know the history. Everyone does. There's the infamous case of the palace maid and the imperial physician, caught kissing in the hall of mental cultivation. They were tied together and thrown into the lake. No trial. No names listed in the punishment records. Just 2 ink blots erased by water. Then there's the crown prince's consort, who was said to have carried on a secret romance with a eunuch. When it was discovered, she was ordered to commit suicide by hanging. He was boiled alive, and still the story survived, told in hushed tones by servants, passed down like an heirloom of warning. And yet, people still try. Because the Forbidden City is also a place of unbearable loneliness. Women locked in their quarters for years, waiting for the emperor to remember them. Eunuchs who gave up their futures, only to be treated like ghosts. Scholars buried in scrolls, mouths sealed by ceremony. In all that quiet, even a single kind word can feel like salvation. Even a fleeting touch can feel like forever. You and he keep meeting, not often, not openly. But you find moments, an extra shift in the scriptorium, a missed meal in the East Pavilion. He gives you a poem one night written in such careful calligraphy it feels like a blade, sharp and dangerous but beautiful. It ends with, "If I die in silence, let my shadow find you." You want to stop. You try to stop, but it's already too late. Because someone sees you. A eunuch whose face you don't remember. Maybe he was sweeping. Maybe he was waiting for this exact opportunity. The next day, the tone in the records office shifts. Your scrolls are reassigned. Your duties reduced. You don't see him anymore. You try to stay calm. Pretend nothing's wrong. But in the Forbidden City, nothing is private. Every absence screams. Then you're summoned. Not by the emperor, that would be too public, too formal. You're brought instead to a small chamber near the inner kitchens, just large enough for a low table and a single chair. An official sits there. His robes are black, his face unreadable. He doesn't ask questions. He just reads a passage from the civil code about improper conduct, about corrupting palace decorum, about personal indulgence unbecoming a servant of the state. You deny nothing. There's nothing to deny, technically. No letters, no witnesses, just air between you. But in the Forbidden City, air is enough to choke. You're not executed. That would draw attention. You're demoted, reassigned to an outer ministry in the provinces. The transfer is swift. Your belongings are packed for you. You don't get to say goodbye. As for him, no one mentions his name. You hear whispers, of course, that he was dismissed, that he was questioned, that he was sent north to the border, that he was promoted, that he was poisoned. The rumours cancel each other out, leaving only silence. Quirky fact. During the Qing Dynasty, palace officials were known to use coded flower arrangements as surveillance traps. A certain blossom left in a chamber could signal disloyalty, forbidden contact, or romantic transgression. The placement of a camellia or a plum branch wasn't just aesthetic, it was often an accusation in disguise. Once, a single misplaced orchid led to the reassignment of 3 court ladies and the public lashing of a low-ranking advisor. There's debate about how many of these stories are real, of course. Some say they're courtly ghost tales, cautionary dramas invented by eunuchs and scribes to scare new servants. Others say they're watered-down versions of real events, rewritten, erased, sanitized. But it doesn't matter now. You spend the rest of your career in a coastal prefecture, cataloguing grain taxes and supervising rice storage. The work is dull, the days uneventful, but no one watches you anymore. That's its own kind of freedom. Sometimes you write poems, not for publication, just for yourself. One of them ends, "If the walls could speak, they'd lie, but the wind never learned how." You burn it after writing. And yet, even now in dreams, you walk those halls again. You turn the corner and see him standing there, brush in hand, eyes full of something soft and dangerous. You smile. You speak. He answers. And in the dream, no one is watching. You're in a candlelit room that smells like sandalwood and something sweeter, something unfamiliar. A faint haze lingers in the air. Herbs burned just moments before, still curling in ribbons above the brazier. You sit cross-legged on a woven mat, your palms open, your pulse steady but deep beneath your skin. Across from you is the alchemist, or the priestess, or the apothecary's daughter. She's called different things in different parts of the city, but you know her by her voice, low, deliberate, threaded with knowledge that makes even silence feel like it's being taught a lesson. She speaks to you softly now, asking questions about your dreams, your body, your grief. Not your name. Names don't matter here. Intention does. You didn't come to her seeking love. Not exactly. You came looking for clarity, or maybe just something to dull the ache that's followed you since they left. Whoever they were. The one you weren't allowed to keep. The one you still see when you close your eyes. But she knew the real reason the moment she saw you. Your heart is louder than your voice, she said. That's why it's dangerous. In ancient China, desire was rarely discussed out loud, but it was never entirely repressed. It found its voice in the folds of Taoist texts, the curves of bronze talismans, the powdery pages of medical scrolls. Taoism, unlike Confucianism, didn't deny the body's wisdom. It listened to it, studied it, played with it, and in the hands of certain scholars and mystics it even celebrated desire, not as corruption, but as energy, as movement, as potential. You learn that quickly here. She brews you a tea of chrysanthemum and red dates, laced with something bitter. You drink it anyway. She places a bronze mirror between you and instructs you to watch, not your reflection, but the way your face changes as she speaks about longing, memory, touch. She never says the word love. But you feel it rise in your chest all the same, blooming with every breath. Then she begins her work. You've heard stories of Taoist rituals, some real, some draped in rumour. There were sects, particularly in early medieval China, that practiced heqi, joining of energies, through controlled intimacy. Not as indulgence, but as sacred exchange. Breath, body, and spirit aligned. These practices were secretive, deeply symbolic, and often misunderstood by outsiders. Most dismissed them as licentious. But those who truly studied the Tao knew it wasn't about indulgence, it was about alchemy. She tells you that love, if restrained too tightly, becomes poison. That longing, if ignored, curdles into illness. She's treated noble women wasting away in cold chambers, scribes who bled from the gums after years of silent grief. Emotion is not weakness, she says. It's a current. You either move with it, or you drown. And so, you move with it. You tell her the story, the one you've told no one, how you loved someone beneath your class, how you nearly fled, or nearly confessed, or nearly lost everything for a single look. She listens with eyes that don't judge, only receive. When you're done, she nods once and hands you a pouch of herbs. For dreams, she says, they'll help you finish what you never began. There's a story she tells you in return, an old one, about a Taoist adept who fell in love with a spirit. He knew she wasn't human, knew it from the way her shadow vanished in certain moonlight, from how the leaves didn't move when she walked. But he loved her anyway. When he tried to bind her to this world, she wept, not from sorrow, but from gratitude. You loved me without needing to keep me, she said, and then she left. He never saw her again. But his next meditation lasted 7 days. He emerged enlightened, or depending on the source, completely mad. Quirky historical detail? Some Taoist manuals included recipes for elixirs of longing. Herbal concoctions meant not to suppress desire, but to transmute it. Mugwort, goji berries, honeyed root. They were brewed during specific lunar phases and consumed in pairs, one for each lover. The idea was that shared emotional states could align energy fields. Whether it worked or not, no one can say. But the recipes are still studied in old pharmacopoeias. You ask her if the heart can heal through ritual alone. She smiles. Not heal, but transform. Yes. The debate among scholars is ongoing, of course. Some insist that Taoist love practices were metaphors, philosophical exercises wrapped in poetic language. Others argue they were very real, passed quietly through generations of midwives, monks and mystics who understood the link between love and illness, desire and energy. There's truth in both views. What matters more is what you choose to believe now. You return the next day. Not because you expect anything more, not because you're still hoping for the one who left, but because something in you shifted. You write again, eat more slowly, sleep without the weight of dreams you can't finish. One evening, she gives you a wooden comb and says, bury this under the full moon. When you no longer remember why, your heart is safe again. You do as she says, weeks pass, then months. You never speak of her to anyone, but every time you light a candle in the rain or hear a poem whispered in a voice like wind, you remember the quiet lesson she gave you. That desire is not a shameful thing. That longing, when honoured, becomes light. That love, even forbidden, doesn't have to end in ruin. It can become ritual. It begins with the scent of ink and wet stone. You're in the cellar of a tea house that isn't really a tea house, sitting on a wooden crate that once held a rice wine, watching as a man in a threadbare scholar's robe seals another envelope with wax. Around you, the low murmur of revolution hums like a swarm of bees just behind the walls. It's dangerous, it's foolish, it's utterly irresistible, and the worst part, you're in love with him. He calls himself Jun, not his real name. No one here uses their real name. You go by Lan. You told him it was the name of a forgotten poetess. He didn't ask which one, he only smiled. You met him during a protest, not the noisy kind, just a circle of people reciting banned verses in a public square, knowing full well the patrols would break it up within the hour. He stood next to you, his voice steady, even as yours trembled. Later, when the soldiers scattered the crowd and the books were seized, you found yourself hiding behind the same garden wall. He had a bruised cheek and a grin like a paper cut. Was it worth it? He asked. You said, yes, and you meant it. You didn't know then that he was part of something bigger, that he and the others weren't just reciting poetry, they were planning, organising, using love of language to light the fuse of something explosive. And you just wanted to feel something. Anything. After years of silence and stillness, you wanted to believe that words could still make walls crack. So you joined them. You started small, copying flyers, smuggling banned texts in hollowed-out scrolls, delivering messages between hidden cells. They trusted you because you asked no questions, because you looked like someone who'd been loyal all their life. That was your talent, being invisible. But Jun saw you, not just the surface, not just the obedient mask. He saw the hunger, the grief, the old bruises from loves you'd buried and never named. He never asked about them, but he gave you something to do with your hands, something to believe in. And maybe that was more dangerous than the politics, because in this game, this fragile underground world of whispers and oaths, love is not a comfort, it's a target. He kissed you once, on a rooftop, after a successful drop. It was raining, your lips were cold. The city below buzzed like an open wound, and for one perfect moment none of it mattered. You kissed him back. You knew it was a mistake. And it was. Because days later, someone gave a name to the guards. Not yours, not his, but close. A safe house was raided, a cache of letters found. Nothing traced directly to you, but the net tightened. Eyes began following you in the market. One of your contacts disappeared. You told Jun you needed to stop. That love made you soft, that you were getting reckless. He didn't argue, but that night he left a note in your basket of rice cakes. It said only, "The ones who build a fire in the cold don't fear the warmth." There's a long tradition of romantic entanglements wrapped in revolution. From the White Lotus Rebellion to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, forbidden love often bloomed in the soil of political dissent. When the world is falling apart, hearts reach for each other in the wreckage, not because it's smart, but because it's human. One famous case comes from the late Qing period, involving a revolutionary poet named He Zhen and her partner Liu Shipei. She was a radical feminist, he was a philologist. Together they published scathing critiques of the imperial system, but it was their letters, full of longing and rage and coded tenderness, that marked them as dangerous. When their press was raided, she was imprisoned. He disappeared. Years later, she died in obscurity, but their writings lived on. And here's the strange part. Scholars still debate whether Zhen and Liu were in love, or whether their relationship was performative, revolutionary theatre. But the debate misses the point. Sometimes love is political because it dares to exist. Back in your own life, the crackdown begins in earnest. You're warned to disappear. You pack nothing. Take back alleys. Move by night. John is already gone. They say he crossed the river 2 days ago, or was arrested, or killed. No one knows. You keep walking. You end up in a village where no one asks questions. You teach calligraphy to children. You tell yourself the movement will continue without you, that your absence is a kind of offering, that your love wasn't the reason it fell apart. But sometimes, in the quiet hours, you read the poem he left behind. The last one, ink smudged by rain. It ends, "When the fire has no more wood, may your hands remember mine." Quirky fact. Some rebels carried lockets or rings with hidden compartments, tiny scrolls tucked inside, inscribed with verses. Not propaganda, not strategy, just love, carried not to inspire revolts, but to remind them what they were fighting for. You still have yours. You never open it. You never need to, because even now the words still burn. The rains haven't stopped for days. You stand under a paper parasol on the edge of a crumbling courtyard, water cascading from broken tiles above, the stone path below slick and shimmering. The old Qing mansion around you is a skeleton. Gutted furniture, rotted beams, vines sneaking through window frames like nature reclaiming what the dynasty lost. But somewhere in these ruins there's a story that still breathes. You didn't come here for history. You came because someone told you she used to live here. The woman in the photograph. The one whose eyes you've dreamed about long after you stopped believing in love stories. Her name was Yusiu, and she wasn't supposed to exist. Born to a Manchu military family in the waning days of the Qing dynasty, she was the product of contradiction. Raised on etiquette and imperial tradition, but hungry for the modern world already crashing through the gates. She wore her hair in the old style, but read newspapers hidden under poetry scrolls. She practiced calligraphy in the morning and secretly translated French novels at night. And she fell in love, fiercely, disastrously, with a Han revolutionary. He wasn't supposed to exist in her life either. He was from the south, an orphan of rebellion, a teacher with a quiet smile and ink-stained fingers. They met during one of her outings to the book market, where she pretended to shop for Confucian classics, while actually scanning pamphlets on democracy and foreign rights. He corrected her pronunciation once. That's all it took. They were caught in each other's orbits from that day forward. They knew it was forbidden, not just in terms of status. Manchu and Han still carried tension like a wound under fresh skin. But because she was engaged, a childhood arrangement, an aristocratic match, she tried to break it. Her parents refused. "You may read what you like," her mother told her, "but you will marry as we say." So she ran, with him. They fled to Shanghai in the chaos following the fall of the dynasty, thinking the collapse of an empire meant the birth of freedom. For a time, it was. They lived in a single room above a tea shop, survived on rice and leftover pastries, debated politics by candlelight, made love on a straw mat while revolution raged outside their window. It should have been a beginning. But even in new cities, old loyalties find you. Someone informed on them. Her father, humiliated by her defection, sent men to drag her back. She was brought home and locked in this mansion, the one now drowning in rain, cut off from letters, friends, and the world she dared to want. The revolutionary was arrested under fabricated charges and exiled inland, where he eventually died of pneumonia. Yuxiu never married, never spoke of him again, but she never stopped writing. You hold one of her letters now, rescued from a second-hand bookstore tucked between modern apartment blocks. The ink is faded, but her voice is still sharp. She writes of light on river water, of rain dripping through broken windows, of love as an infection she willingly let fester. "They say I lost everything," she writes, "but I lost nothing that was truly mine." Quirky truth. After the fall of the Qing, many noble women were quietly erased from history. Those who refused to conform to the new republic's expectations, by remaining unmarried, childless, or politically defiant, were labelled as unstable or forgotten altogether. Some were called mad, others were simply locked away. There's debate among historians about women like Yusiu. Some argue she was a tragic figure, manipulated by romance into ruin. Others see her as a proto-feminist, sacrificing status for self-determination. But standing here, in what's left of her world, you feel something else, that she simply chose love when everything told her not to, and that choice rewrote her. As you walk through her ruined home, you spot the painted fragments of her life, the edge of a red lacquer screen, a shattered porcelain vase, a fan inscribed with half a poem. You can't tell if it's hers, but it feels like it. It reads, "No emperor rules the heart. Let the flood come." Outside, the sky opens further, thunder cracking like a wound in the heavens. You sit on the stone step where she must have sat once, watching storms, dreaming of letters that would never arrive. And for a moment you see her, Not clearly, not as a ghost, but as memory walking the same paths. You imagine her brushing water from her sleeves, head held high, waiting not for rescue, but for the world to catch up to her. Love in the last years of the Qing wasn't simple. It collided with revolution, with identity, with the fall of a 1,000-year regime. Marriages were still arranged. Women still auctioned into alliances, but the cracks were forming, and some, like Yu, slipped through those cracks and dared to want more. You leave the house just as the rain begins to soften, and for the first time in days, the light changes. It's not bright, but it's enough. You know you'll never meet her. She's long gone, buried in a grave no one marked. But you'll keep her letter, and you'll write one of your own. Maybe not to anyone in particular, maybe not even to someone real, but to the part of you that still believes in forbidden love. Because in the end, what she wrote is true. You only lose what was never yours. The wind from the Yellow River has a certain bitterness to it, like it remembers every secret ever whispered along its banks. You're standing near the shore now, wrapped in a traveller's cloak, the taste of dust thick on your tongue. You've come a long way, through provinces and seasons, past crumbled walls and broken love stories, and here, at the end of it all, you find yourself facing a tomb, modest, hidden. No marker but a willow tree and a single stone lantern, blackened by time. But you know who lies beneath. He was a general, she was a courtesan. That's how the story begins, anyway. Their names have been twisted over the years, retold in local ballads, carved into opera scripts, whispered in brothels and taverns. But the truth, the one that never made it into the official records, is buried here, beneath this tree, beside this river, in a grave that was never supposed to exist. She was educated, which already made her dangerous. The daughter of a failed scholar, sold to a pleasure house in Luoyang when her father died. But she kept reading. She knew more poetry than her clients, and she sang not just with her voice, but with something deeper, something that made powerful men lean forward and forget their wives' names. He met her when he was 32, a rising star in the Han military, just returned from a campaign in the north. She was 24, known as Red Willow, in the tea-house circuit for her sad songs and her scarlet silk sleeves. Their first meeting lasted hours, though all they did was talk. He kept coming back. She told him the truth, that love had never stayed with her, that all her verses ended in silence. He said he didn't want poems. He wanted her. But it wasn't that simple. It never is. He was promised to a governor's daughter, a union forged in politics, backed by the emperor himself. Refusing would be seen as arrogance. Accepting would mean leaving Red Willow behind, so he did neither. He kept her, quietly, bought her a home in the countryside, visited when he could. Their love bloomed in the shadows of obligation. Every meeting was a gamble, every letter sent through a servant's trembling hands. And then the war came. He left again, for years. When he returned, he was a hero, and she was gone. Dead, they said. Illness. No details. Just a sealed room and an empty bed. But the truth? She wasn't sick. She was erased. His fiancée had found the letters. The governor had issued orders. The pleasure house that once protected her now turned her over. She was dragged from her home and given a choice. Disappear quietly, or ruin the man she loved. She chose disappearance, but she left one thing behind. A final poem, carved into the base of a wooden dressing screen. You found it once, years ago, in a dusty market stall. At the time, you didn't know who wrote it. But now, it all clicks into place. It said, "Love is not a mirror. It does not show who's worthy, only who is brave." Quirky fact, some Han generals carried tokens from courtesans into battle. Ribbons, poems, combs. Not wives, not noble women, courtesans. These women were seen as less respectable, yet often more beloved. Their love was private, passionate, and punished. And yet, it endured in hidden keepsakes long after the public marriages faded. There's a debate among historians about whether this kind of love was real or transactional. But the answer, as always, lies in the details. The way certain letters were written in the same hand even after decades. The way anonymous poems in palace collections use the same signature metaphor. Red sleeves in winter. The way, here and now, you find a grave that no one mentions in official records, but someone still tends. Because at the base of the tombstone, fresh incense sticks burn. A bowl of fruit sits untouched, still dewy. Someone else remembers her. Maybe a descendant. Maybe a stranger like you, obsessed with stories no one once told. You kneel, light a stick, whisper her name. Not the one she was sold under, not the one embroidered on her fan, but the name he called her when no one was listening. Then you whisper his. And for a moment, the river seems to pause. The wind softens. The willow tree above you shivers, not in grief, but in acknowledgement. Because forbidden love may be silenced, buried, broken into 1,000 pieces, but if even one person remembers, it never truly dies. This is the end of your journey. You've walked through centuries of rules and rebellions, weddings and executions, scrolls and kisses and blade-thin secrets. You've seen lovers run, fall, vanish. Some got away, most didn't. Some left poems, others left only echoes. But they all wanted the same thing. Not just love, but the right to choose love, even when the world punished them for it. That's the real forbidden part. Not the passion, not the danger, but the freedom. You rise, step away from the tomb. The wind picks up again, carrying the scent of burnt incense and river water. You don't look back. You don't need to. Because now someone else will come. Someone will ask. Someone will remember. And the story, like love, will survive. So now here you are, lying back in the soft hush of your room, eyes heavy, maybe your blanket pulled just up under your chin. You've just walked through dynasties, dust, letters, moonlight, poems, and silence. You've stepped inside the lives of lovers who weren't supposed to love, touched their trembling hands, heard the last lines of their last verses. You've seen how love, in ancient China, could be its own form of rebellion. A dangerous, glittering fire lit in a paper house. You felt how something as soft as affection could bring down legacies, stir courts into frenzy, and send two people running across provinces with nothing but a half-written poem and hope. And if you've learned anything, besides the fact that falling for someone in the Qing dynasty was basically a coin toss with death, it's that love is persistent. Even in a world where everything was controlled, ranked, betrothed, and bound to ancestral duty, people still found ways to reach for one another. Through code, through metaphor, through midnight meetings and silk-wrapped messages hidden in sleeves. They were careful, sometimes clever, often foolish, almost always punished. But they did it anyway. Why? Because no matter how strict the dynasty, how harsh the punishment, how long the silk scroll of laws and expectations, humans are going to human. They're going to fall for someone who smiles at the wrong moment. They're going to touch hands in a crowded hall. They're going to write a poem with just enough ambiguity to deny, but just enough truth to scream. And sometimes they're going to risk everything, because the heart does not check in with the law before it beats. Maybe you saw a bit of yourself in one of them. Or maybe not. Maybe you're just here for the stories, the quiet kind that history tries to bury but never quite manages to erase. Either way, thank you for wandering through this shadowy, shimmering world with me. It's been a long night of ghosts, glances, and goodbyes. Now, exhale. Sink deeper into your pillow. Let the river fade, let the incense drift. Let the secrets settle in your bones. And remember, no matter the dynasty, no matter the danger, there's always someone writing a love poem in the margins.